This is a reading of an outline of esoteric science by Rudolf Штайнер. It was published in 1909 and is volume 13 in the Bibliographic Survey. I believe it was 1909. Chapter 1. The Character of Esoteric Science. The ancient term, esoteric science, is used to describe the contents of this book. This term immediately rouses the most contradictory feelings among contemporary people. For many it is somewhat repellent or calls forth derision, pitying smiles, and perhaps even contempt. They imagine that a way of thinking that describes itself in this way can only be based on idle, fantastic dreaming, that this alleged science can only conceal an impulse to reinstate all kinds of superstitions that those familiar with the quote-unquote true scientific approach and quote-unquote real striving for knowledge are quite right in avoiding. To others, what is meant by this term seems to provide them with something they cannot acquire in any other way. Depending on their personal predispositions, they are drawn to it, either out of a deep inner longing for knowledge or out of the curiosity of a refined soul. Between these sharply divergent opinions, there are all kinds of possible intermediate stages of conditional rejection or acceptance of what different individuals may think of on hearing the words esoteric science. For many people, the term esoteric science has a magical ring to it, because it seems to appease their fateful obsession with knowing of something unknown, mysterious, or even obscure, with a knowledge that cannot be acquired naturally. Many people do not want to satisfy their soul's deepest longings with something that can be clearly known. They tend to believe that in addition to what is recognizable and knowable in the world, there must also be something that eludes cognition. Regarding their deepest longing for knowledge, and with a peculiar illogicality, they do not notice. They reject everything known and choose to accept only something that cannot be said to be knowable through any natural form of research. Let me read that sentence again. Regarding their deepest longing for knowledge, and with a peculiar illogicality they do not notice, they reject everything known and choose to accept only something that cannot be said to be knowable through any natural form of research. Anyone who speaks of quote-unquote esoteric science would do well to keep in mind the need to confront misunderstandings caused by some of its advocates who are striving not for knowledge, but for its opposite. This account is aimed at readers who will not allow their impartiality to be shaken by the fact that a term calls forth prejudices under certain circumstances. There can be no talk here of a knowledge that is secret in the sense of being accessible only to certain people because of some especially favorable destiny. We will do justice to the term esoteric science as it is used here if we think of what Goethe had in mind when he spoke of the quote-unquote revealed mysteries in the phenomena of the universe. Footnote, quote, there are so many revealed mysteries because the feeling for them becomes conscious in so few people, and these few, fearing to harm themselves and others, do not give voice to their inner explanations, unquote. Goethe in a letter to C. L. F. Schultz, November 28, 1821. End footnote. His view sees what remains secret, quote-unquote esoteric or unrevealed, in the phenomena we grasp only with our senses and our sense-bound intellect, as the content of a supersensible way of knowing. Footnote, some people have rejected the term esoteric science, as used by the author in earlier editions of this book, on the grounds that a science cannot be something that is secret or esoteric to anyone. This objection would have been correct if that had been the intent in using this term, but that is not the case. The natural sciences, the sciences of nature, cannot be called natural in the sense that they belong to everyone by nature. Similarly, the author understands esoteric science to be not a secret science, but a science, quote-unquote, of the esoteric. a science that deals with what is secret and unrevealed in the phenomena of the universe as far our ordinary means of cognition are concerned. This science, however, should not remain a secret for anyone who searches for its knowledge in appropriate ways. End of footnote. Of course, to those who restrict science to what is revealed through the senses and the intellect that serves them, what is meant here by esoteric science does not constitute a science. If such people wish to understand themselves, however, they must admit that they reject esoteric science not on the basis of well-founded insight, but simply on the authority of their purely personal feelings. In order to realize this, all we need to do is to consider how sciences come about and what significance they have in human life. The definitive factor in the birth of a science is not the object that is studied, but the type of human soul activity that takes place during the scientific quest. The activity and attitude of the soul involved in the study of science is what we need to look at. If we acquire the habit of exercising activity of this sort only when dealing with what the senses disclose, we may easily succumb to the opinion that the sense perception is the essential factor. In that case, we fail to look at the fact that specific activities and attitudes of the human soul have been applied, but only to what is sense perceptible. However, it is possible to transcend this arbitrary, self-imposed limitation and look at the character of scientific activity itself, without regard to its specific application. This is our basis for speaking of knowledge of the non-sensory content of the world as scientific. The human power of cognition tries to become involved with this content in the same way that it would otherwise become involved with the world's natural scientific content. It is the intent of spiritual science to free the methods and attitudes of scientific research from their particular application to the relationships and processes of sensory facts, while preserving their way of thinking and other attributes. Natural science attempts to speak about non-sensory things in the same way that the natural sciences speak about sense-perceptible things. While natural scientific methods of research and ways of thinking stop short at the sensory world, esoteric science views the soul's work in the natural world as a means of self-education and attempts to apply the faculties that develop in this way to non-sensory domains. Instead of attempting to speak about sensory phenomena as such, esoteric science speaks about the non-sensory contents of the world in the same way that scientists speak about its sense-perceptible contents. In this process, it retains the inner attitude of the scientific method, which is what makes the study of nature a science in the first place. This permits esoteric science to call itself a science. When we begin to consider it, we will find that the significance of the natural science in human life is not exhausted in acquiring knowledge about nature, since this knowledge can never lead to anything except experiences of what the human soul itself is not. The soul principle does not live in what we know about nature. It lives in the process of knowing. The soul experiences itself during its active involvement with nature, and the result of this living involvement is something other than knowledge about nature itself, namely the self-development experienced in acquiring this knowledge. Esoteric science attempts to apply the result of this self-development to areas that transcend mere nature. It is not the intent of esoteric scientists to underestimate the value of the natural sciences. On the contrary, they try to acknowledge it even more than the natural scientists do. They know that it is impossible to establish any science without the exacting way of thinking that is the rule in the natural sciences. But they also know that after this exactitude has been acquired by genuinely entering into the spirit of natural scientific thought, the soul's strength can hold it fast and apply it to other fields. Something appears at this point, however, that may cause misgivings. While observing nature, the soul is guided by the object under observation to a much greater extent than it is while observing the world's non-sensory contents, when it has to be able to hold fast to the essence of the scientific way of thinking out of purely inner impulses to a much greater extent. Since many people believe, although not consciously, that only the guidance of natural phenomena allows us to retain this essence, they tend to decide dogmatically that as soon as this guidance is abandoned, the soul with its scientific method is left groping in the dark. These people have not become aware of the distinctive character of this method. For the most part, they base their judgment on errors that necessarily arise when someone whose scientific attitude has not been sufficiently reinforced by observing natural phenomena nonetheless proceeds to observe non-sensory domains. Such cases naturally give rise to a lot of unscientific talk about the world's non-sensory content. However, this is not because such talk is essentially incapable of being scientific, but only because in this particular instance the scientific self-education that comes from observing nature was neglected. With regard to what has just been said, however, anyone wanting to speak about esoteric science must keep a sharp eye out for all the distractions and illusions that can arise from conjecturing about the revealed mysteries of the world without approaching them scientifically. And yet it would be counterproductive, right at the beginning of an account of esoteric science, to speak about all the possible aberrations that discredit its research in the minds of biased people, because these people conclude from the very existence of the aberrations, and it is true that they are very numerous, that the entire undertaking is unjustified. In most instances, however, scientists or scientifically minded critics reject esoteric science dogmatically, as was described earlier, and their reference to the aberrations is merely a pretext that is often unconscious. Discussion with such opponents will prove futile. Indeed, nothing prevents them from raising the very justified objection that there is no way of determining from the outset whether the person who believes others are in error actually possesses the firm foundation described above. Therefore, all that can be done by people who are striving in the direction of esoteric science is to present what they believe is permissible for them to say. Whether this belief is justified can only be decided by others, and in fact only by those who avoid dogmatic statements of any sort and are able to enter into how these esoteric researchers communicate the revealed mysteries of cosmic events. Of course, the researchers will be obliged to show how what they present relates to other achievements of knowledge and of life. They will also need to show what opposition is possible, and to what extent life's immediate outer sense-perceptible reality confirms their observations. However, they should never attempt to present things in a way that depends on the art of persuasion rather than on content for its effect. Esoteric scientific accounts often meet with the objection that they do not prove what they present, that they merely make some assertion or other, and say that esoteric science has determined this to be true. Do not misunderstand the account that follows by thinking that any part of it is being presented in this manner. An effort is being made here to allow the capability that unfolds in the soul through studying nature to continue to develop according to its own essence. In the course of this development, the soul encounters supersensible facts. It is assumed that every reader who is able to really go into what has been presented will necessarily run up against these facts. The moment we enter the domain of spiritual science, however, we encounter a difference between it and purely natural scientific observation. In the natural sciences, facts are present in the field of the sensory world. Scientists who present these facts regard the activity of the soul as something that recedes into the background in the face of sense-perceptible relationships and processes. Those who present spiritual scientific facts must place this soul activity in the forefront, because their readers only arrive at the facts by making this activity their own in the right way. Unlike the facts of natural science, which although not understood are still available for human perception even without any soul activity, spiritual scientific facts enter into our perception only through activity on the part of the soul. Thus, those presenting spiritual science presume that the readers are accompanying them on the search for these facts. Their presentation consists of recounting the discovery of these facts, and is governed not by personal whim, but by a scientific attitude trained by natural science. Therefore, they must also speak about the means they use to become able to observe non-sensory, super-sensible things. By attempting to present an esoteric scientific subject, we will soon see that this leads us to acquire concepts and ideas that we did not possess before. The new thoughts we acquire about the nature of proof are also different from our previous conceptions of it. We learn to recognize that when natural science is explained, quote-unquote, proof is something brought toward it from the outside, so to speak. In spiritual scientific thinking, however, the activity applied to proving something in natural scientific thinking is already present in the search for the facts. We cannot find these facts if the path that leads to them does not constitute a proving process in itself. Anyone who really follows this path already experiences the element of proof, and nothing more can be accomplished by means of a proof applied from outside. Failure to recognize this characteristic of esoteric science has led to many misunderstandings. The whole of esoteric science must spring from two thoughts that can take root in each human being. For the esoteric scientist, as the term is used in this book, these two thoughts express facts that can be experienced if we apply the right means. For many other people, these thoughts constitute extremely debatable claims that can provoke a great deal of argument and may even be proved to be impossible. The first of these thoughts is that behind the visible world there is an invisible one, a world that is temporarily concealed, at least as far as our senses and sense-bound thinking are concerned. The second is that by developing human capacities that lie dormant in us, it is possible to enter this hidden world. Some people may say that there is no such hidden world, that the world we perceive with our senses is the only one, that it contains everything necessary to solve its riddles, and that even if we are far from being able to answer all our existential questions at present, a time will come when sensory experiences and the science based on them will be able to provide the answers. Others say that we cannot state definitively that there is no hidden world behind the visible one, but our human powers of cognition cannot penetrate this world because they have limits that they cannot overstep. Although those who need faith, quote-unquote, may take refuge in a world of that sort, a true science, based on the guarantee of fact, cannot be concerned with such a world. A third group sees it as rather presumptuous to want to penetrate into a domain where we must renounce, quote-unquote, knowledge and be content with, quote-unquote, faith. Those who adhere to this position find it wrong for the feeble human being to want to penetrate into a world that is supposed to be the exclusive province of religious life. Still others raise the objection that it is possible for everyone to share a common knowledge of the facts of the sense-perceptible world, but since knowledge of the supersensible things is only a matter of personal, individual opinion, we should not speak of universal certainty in such things. And there are others who make many other assertions. It becomes clear that observing the visible world presents us with riddles that can never be solved on the basis of the facts of this world alone. They will never be solved in this way, regardless of how far the science of these facts may advance, because the very inner nature of the visible facts points clearly to a hidden world. If we do not realize this, we are shutting ourselves off to the riddles that spring up everywhere out of the facts of the sensory world. We choose not to see certain questions and riddles, and so we believe that all questions can be answered by means of sense-perceptible facts. The questions we choose to ask may indeed all be answered by the facts we expect will be discovered in the future. There is no reason not to concede that this is the case. But why should we wait for answers to certain things if we ask no questions about them? Those who aspire to an esoteric science are only saying that the questions they ask are a matter of course for them, and should be acknowledged as fully legitimate expressions of the human soul. After all, science cannot be forced into narrow confines by forbidding people to ask unbiased questions. In response to the opinion that there are limits to human cognition which we cannot overstep, and which force us to come to a halt in front of any invisible world that may be there, it must be said that there can be no doubt in anyone's mind that it is not possible to push one's way into an invisible world with that particular kind of cognition. For anyone who believes that form of cognition to be the one and only form, it is impossible to arrive at any other view of the matter than that human beings are denied access to any higher world that may exist. But it can also be said that if it is possible to develop another form of cognition, this could lead into the supersensible world. If we consider this form of cognition impossible, we reach a viewpoint that makes any talk of a supersensible world seem like pure nonsense. To an impartial judge, however, the only possible reason for this viewpoint is that its champions are unfamiliar with any other form of cognition. Yet how can people pass judgment on something while insisting that they know nothing about it? Unbiased thinking must concur with the statement that we should speak only about things we know and not make statements about things we do not know. This kind of thinking can only speak of people's right to communicate what they have experienced, but not of any right on their part to declare something impossible if they know or choose to know nothing about it. No one can ever deny others the right to ignore the supersensible. But there is never any legitimate reason for people to declare themselves authorities not only on what they themselves are capable of knowing, but also on what they suppose cannot be known by any human being. In the case of those who declare it presumptuous to enter the domain of the supersensible, an esoteric scientific view must call their attention to the fact that it is possible to enter this domain, and that we sin against the faculties we have been given if we allow them to stagnate instead of developing them and putting them to use. However, anyone who believes that views concerning the supersensible world are strictly a matter of personal opinions and feelings denies what is common to all human beings. It is certainly true that individuals must find insight into such things on their own, but it is also a fact that all people who go far enough come to the same insight about these things rather than to different insights. Differences exist only when people try to approach the highest truths through an arbitrary personal whim rather than by a scientifically guaranteed path. It must be admitted without reservation, however, that only those who are willing to immerse themselves in the unique character of the esoteric scientific path are capable of acknowledging that it is correct. If we acknowledge, or even merely assume or surmise from the manifest world the existence of a hidden world, and if our awareness that our powers of cognition are capable of development compels us to feel that this hidden world can reveal itself to us, then each one of us will be able to find the way to esoteric science at the individually appropriate time. When individuals have been led to esoteric science by these soul experiences, several prospects open up before them. One is the prospect of finding the answer to certain questions posed by their craving for knowledge. Another is the quite different prospect of victory over everything that impedes and weakens life. In a certain higher sense, it signifies a weakening of life, or even a soul death, when a person is forced to deny or turn away from the supersensible world. Under certain circumstances, it even leads to despair when someone loses hope that the hidden will be revealed. At the same time, the various forms of this death and despair oppose esoteric scientific efforts on the inner level of the soul. They set in when our inner strength dwindles. If we are then to have any strength for life at all, it must come from outside. Then we perceive the things, beings, and processes that appear to our senses, and we analyze them with our intellect. They cause us joy and sorrow. They drive us to whatever actions we are capable of. We can carry on like this for a while, but eventually we reach the point of dying inwardly, because we have exhausted what can be drawn from the world in this way for a human being's sake. This is not a statement stemming from the personal experience of one individual. It results from an unbiased consideration of all human life. What shields us from exhausting this source is the hidden element that rests within the depths of things. Ultimately, if the strength to descend into these depths, to draw up new strength for life, dies away in a human being, the outer aspect of things also proves to be no longer conducive to life. This is by no means a matter of concern only to the individual human being with his or her personal well-being and misfortune. Precisely through true esoteric scientific observations, we arrive at the certainty that from a higher standpoint, an individual's well-being and misfortune are intimately related to the well-being or misfortune of the whole world. We come to the insight that we are causing damage to the whole world and all the beings in it when we do not develop our own forces in the right way. If we ravage our life by losing our connection to the supersensible world, not only do we destroy something within us, something that can ultimately drive us to despair as it dies off, but our weakness also creates a hindrance to the evolution of the entire world in which we live. Now, it is possible for human beings to deceive themselves. We can succumb to the belief that there is no hidden element, that what appears to our senses and our intellect includes everything that can possibly exist. This deception, however, is only possible on the surface of consciousness, not in its depths. Our feeling and desire do not submit to this deceptive belief. In one way or another, they will always long for something hidden. If this is withheld from us, it forces us into doubt, into uncertainty in life, or even into despair. Cognition that reveals what is hidden is suited to overcoming all this hopelessness, uncertainty, and despair. In short, everything that weakens a life and makes it incapable of performing the services required of it within the world as a whole. This is the beautiful fruit of spiritual scientific knowledge. Rather than merely gratifying our passion for knowledge, it gives our life strength and steadfastness. It draws strength for work and confidence in life from an inexhaustible source. No one who has ever truly approached this source and returns repeatedly to take refuge there will ever go away unstrengthened. There are people who do not want to know anything about such knowledge, because they see something unhealthy in what has just been said. As far as the outer, superficial aspect of life is concerned, these people are right. They do not want what life offers in its so-called reality to be diminished in any way. They see it as a weakness when people turn away from reality and seek salvation in a hidden world that seems fantastic and dreamed up. If we do not want to fall into a state of pathological dreaminess and weakness in our spiritual scientific search, we must acknowledge that such objections are partially justified. They rest on healthy judgment that leads to a half-truth rather than to a whole one, only because it does not thrust its way into the depths of things, but remains on the surface. If striving for supersensible knowledge were likely to weaken life and turn people away from true reality, then such objections would certainly be strong enough to pull the foundation out from under this spiritual trend. However, it is not appropriate for esoteric scientific efforts to respond to such opinions by defending themselves in the usual sense of the word. In this case, too, they can speak only out of their own merit, which is apparent to any unbiased person, and make it evident that they supplement the life forces and strength for life of anyone who immerses him or herself in them in the right way. Such efforts cannot turn a person into a dreamer or someone who is alienated from the world. The strength they provide comes from the sources of life that are the origin of the soul and spiritual parts of us. Still other obstacles may confront many people when they first approach an esoteric scientific search. It is a fundamental truth that readers of esoteric scientific accounts find descriptions of soul experiences which they can follow in order to approach the world's supersensible contents. But while this is the ideal, it still has to be realized in actual practice. Readers must first absorb a fairly large number of supersensible experiences recounted by others without experiencing them personally. This cannot be otherwise, and will also be true of this book. The author will describe what he believes he knows about the nature of human beings and what happens to them at birth, at death, and in the body-free state and the spiritual world. He will also describe the evolution of the earth and of humanity. It could seem that a certain amount of alleged knowledge is being presented like dogma, as if belief based on authority were called for. However, this is not the case. In fact, what can be known about the world's supersensible content is present in the author as a living soul content, and immersing yourself in this content kindles impulses in your own soul, which then lead to the corresponding supersensible facts. In reading about spiritual scientific knowledge, you are active in a different way than you are in reading accounts of sense-perceptible facts. If you read accounts of the sense-perceptible world, you read about them. But if you read accounts of supersensible facts in the right way, you immerse yourself in the stream of spiritual existence. By taking in the results of spiritual research, we also set out on our own inner path toward discovering these results for ourselves. It is true that to begin with, what is meant here is often not noticed at all by those who read it. People imagine entering the spiritual world to be much too similar to a sensory experience, and so they find their experiences in reading about this world much too thought-like. But if we are truly absorbing these things as thoughts, we are already in the midst of the spiritual world, and must only realize that we are already experiencing, although we do not notice it, what we believed we were merely receiving in the form of thoughts communicated to us. Let me read that again. But if we are truly absorbing these things as thoughts, we are already in the midst of the spiritual world, and must only realize that we are already experiencing, although we do not notice it, what we believed we were merely receiving in the form of thoughts communicated to us. The real nature of what we have experienced will become completely clear to us if we actually practice what is described in the second and last part of this book as the path to supersensible knowledge. It would be easy to believe the opposite, that the path would have to be described first, but that is not the case. To anyone who simply does exercises in order to enter the supersensible world without paying any soul attention to specific facts about it, this world will remain an indistinct and confused chaos. We learn to find our way into that world naively, so to speak, in the process of learning about some of its specific facts. Only after that do we abandon our unsuspecting naivete and realize that we are fully consciously acquiring for ourselves the experiences that have been communicated to us. If you go into esoteric scientific accounts in depth, you will be convinced that this is the only sure path to supersensible knowledge. You will also realize that the opinion that supersensible knowledge might initially affect us like dogma, through the power of suggestion, as it were, is unfounded, because we acquire the content of this knowledge by means of a soul activity that strips it of any merely suggestive power and only allows it to speak to us in the same way as any truth that addresses our level-headed judgment. Our initial failure to notice that we are living in the spiritual world is not due to lack of thought on our part or to being influenced by suggestion. in taking in what we have read, but only to the subtlety and unfamiliarity of what we've experienced while reading. When we first take in communications such as those in the first part of this book, we begin to participate, with help, in knowledge of the supersensible world, through practical application of the soul exercises given in the second part. We begin to know this world independently. No real scientists will be able to find any essential contradiction between their science, which is based on the facts of the sense world, and how the supersensible world is investigated. These scientists use certain tools and methods. They produce these tools by transforming what, quote-unquote, nature gives them. Supersensible cognition also makes use of a tool, the human being, that must also first be made suitable for higher research. The human abilities and forces that nature provides, without any involvement on the part of the individual, must be transformed into higher ones. This is how we can transform ourselves into instruments for investigating the supersensible world. The end of Chapter 1 of An Outline of Esoteric Science by Rudolf Штайнер. This is Chapter 2 of An Outline of Esoteric Science by Rudolf Штайнер, entitled The Makeup of the Human Being. When we observe the human being from the standpoint of a supersensible mode of cognition, the general principles of this cognitive mode take effect immediately. This way of looking at the human being is based on recognizing the quote-unquote revealed mystery in our human makeup. Of all the elements supersensible knowledge includes in this, the physical body is the only one that is accessible to our senses and our sense-based intellect. To clarify this concept of the physical body, we must turn our attention first to a great riddle that envelops all of our observations of life, the phenomenon of death, and connected with it, so-called inorganic nature, the mineral kingdom, in which death is always inherent. This points to facts that can only be fully explained through supersensible knowledge, and a significant portion of this book will have to be devoted to them. At this point, however, the intent is simply to offer a few ideas for the sake of orientation. Within the manifest world, the physical human body is the part of the human being that is the same as the mineral world. In contrast, everything that differentiates us from minerals cannot be considered part of the physical body. To an unbiased view, the most important fact is that death exposes the aspect of our human makeup that is of the same nature as the mineral kingdom. We can refer to the corpse as the aspect that after death is subject to processes that are found in that kingdom. It can be emphasized that in this element of our human makeup, the corpse, the same substances and forces are at work as in the mineral kingdom. However, it is necessary to emphasize equally strongly that this physical body begins to break down when death sets in. Yet we are also justified in saying that while the same substances and forces are at work in the physical human body as in minerals, as long as we are alive, they work in the service of something higher. Only after death do they work in the physical human body as they do in the mineral kingdom. They then appear in the form that is true to their own nature, that is, as disintegrators of the physical body's form. Thus, in the human being, we must distinguish clearly between what is manifest and what is hidden. During life, a hidden something has to wage a constant battle against the mineral substances and forces in the physical body. If this battle ceases, their mineral effects come to the fore. At this point, supersensible science must get involved. Its job is to look for what wages the battle, for something hidden from sensory observation and accessible only to supersensible observation. A later chapter in this book will discuss how to reach the point where this hidden something becomes as evident to us as sensory phenomena are to our ordinary eyes. For the moment, however, what is revealed to supersensible observation will simply be described. It has already been stated that information on how to approach higher vision can only be of value to people if they first become familiar with accounts of what supersensible research reveals. In this field, it is indeed possible to comprehend things that we cannot yet observe. In fact, understanding is the first step toward achieving vision in the right way. Although the hidden something that fights off the disintegration of the physical body is only visible to higher sight, its effects are clearly evident to a faculty of judgment restricted to manifest phenomena. These effects express themselves in the shape or form that the physical body's mineral substances and forces share during life. Once death sets in, this form gradually disappears, and the physical body becomes part of the rest of the mineral kingdom. However, what prevents the physical substances and forces from going their own way during life, which would cause the physical body to disintegrate, can be observed by supersensible perception as an independent part of our human makeup. This independent element will be called the quote-unquote ether body, or quote-unquote life body. In order to prevent misunderstandings from creeping in right at the outset, there are two things that must be considered with regard to the terms applied to this second element of our human makeup. First, the use of the word ether is different here than it is in modern physics, which describes the medium of light as quote-unquote ether. Here, however, the meaning of the word will be restricted to the one given above. It will be applied to this entity that is accessible to higher vision, but recognizable to sensory perception only because of its effects. That is, because it is capable of giving a particular shape or form to the mineral substances and forces present in the physical body. Second, the word body should also not be misunderstood. After all, we have to use words taken from ordinary language, words that express only sense-perceptible things, to designate the higher things of existence. In sensory terms, of course, the ether body is nothing bodily at all, no matter how fine or delicate a body we might imagine. As the author has discussed in his book Theosophy, his intention in using the terms ether body and life body is not simply to revive the old scientifically outdated idea of quote-unquote life force or quote-unquote vital force. Having arrived at the point of mentioning the ether body or life body in describing supersensible things, we have also reached a point where this description necessarily contradicts some modern-day views. The evolution of the human spirit has led to a situation where talking about such an element of our human makeup is necessarily seen as unscientific nowadays. The materialistic view has reached the point of seeing nothing more in the living human body than an assemblage of physical substances and forces, such as are also found in minerals, in so-called inanimate objects. The only difference is supposed to be that the way they are put together is more complicated in living things than in lifeless matter. Not too long ago, even ordinary science had different views on this subject. If you track down the writings of serious scientists from the first half of the 19th century, you will find that at that time even some quote-unquote real scientists were also aware of something in living bodies that is different from what is present in lifeless minerals. Back then people spoke of a vital force or life force. Admittedly, they did not imagine this life force as the life body described above, but their concept was based, nonetheless, on an inkling that something of this sort does exist. They imagined this life force as supplementing the physical substances and forces of the living body, just as the force of magnetism supplements the plain iron in a magnet. Then came a time when this life force was removed from the stock of scientific concepts, and people tried to explain everything in terms of mere physical and chemical causes. More recently, however, a reaction against this has again set in among some scientific thinkers. In some quarters, it is admitted that assuming the existence of something like a life force is not total nonsense after all. However, even scientists who deign to admit this possibility will not want to make common cause with the view of the life body that has been presented here. As a general rule, engaging these people in dialogue from the viewpoint of supersensible knowledge will lead nowhere. Instead, supersensible knowledge should make a point of recognizing that the materialistic view is a necessary concomitant of our era's great progress in natural science, which is based on a tremendous refining of our methods of sensory observation. In the course of evolution, it is simply part of human nature to raise some specific individual capabilities to a certain degree of perfection at the expense of others from time to time. Human faculties that lead to quote-unquote hidden worlds had to be forced into the background by the exact sensory observation that the natural sciences developed to such a significant extent. But now a time has again come when we need to cultivate these faculties. We will win acknowledgement of what is hidden, not by combating judgments that are the logical consequence of denying the existence of hidden elements, but by showing these elements themselves in the right light, so that they can then be acknowledged by those for whom this time is right. This needed to be said here to keep people from assuming that the author is ignorant of the views of natural science when he talks about an ether body, something that is necessarily seen in many quarters as a figment of the imagination. This ether body, then, is a second part of our higher human makeup. Supersensible knowledge attributes a higher degree of reality to it than to the physical body. Let me read that again. Supersensible knowledge attributes a higher degree of reality to it than to the physical body. A description of this body, as supersensible knowledge sees it, can only be given in later chapters of this book, once the sense in which such descriptions are meant to be taken has become evident. For the moment, let us suffice to say that the ether body permeates the physical body in all its parts, and is seen to be as its architect, so to speak. The shape and form of all our organs are maintained by the ether body's currents and movements. Footnote, see also Rudolf Steiner's lecture cycle, Occult Physiology, Prague, March 20th to the 28th, 1911, GA number 128, particularly the 5th lecture. End of footnote. Our physical heart is based on an ether heart, our physical brain on an ether brain, and so on. The ether body is differentiated just like the physical body, but it is more complicated. In the ether body, everything is in a living, flowing state of interpenetration, whereas in the physical body, distinctly separate parts are present. Having an ether body is common to plants and human beings, in the same way that having a physical body is common to humans and minerals. Every living thing has its own ether body. From the ether body we move on to a further component of our human makeup. To help us visualize this next part, supersensible observation points to the phenomenon of sleep, just as it pointed to death in the case of the ether body. As far as everything manifest is concerned, all our productive actions are based on activity in the waking state. Waking activity, however, is only possible if we repeatedly draw new strength for our exhausted forces from sleep. Doing and thinking disappear during sleep. All suffering and pleasure are submerged as far as our conscious life is concerned. When we awaken, conscious forces rise up out of sleep's unconsciousness like water out of hidden and mysterious springs. The consciousness that sinks down into the dark depths when we fall asleep is the same as the one that rises up when we awaken. According to supersensible cognition, what awakens life again and again from the unconscious state is the third part of our human makeup. We can call it the quote-unquote astral body. Just as the physical body cannot maintain its form by means of the mineral substances and forces it contains, but only by being permeated by the ether body, the forces of the ether body are incapable of illumining themselves with the light of consciousness. Left to its own devices, the ether body would have to remain in an ongoing state of sleep. We might also say that it would only be able to support a plant-like existence within the physical body. A waking ether body is illumined by an astral body. As far as sensory perception is concerned, the effects of the astral body disappear when a person falls asleep. To supersensible observation, however, the astral body is still present, but appears to have separated from the ether body, or lifted out of it. Sensory perception does not deal with the astral body itself, but only with its effects on manifest elements. These effects are not directly present while we sleep. In the same sense that having a physical body is something we share with minerals, and the ether body something we share with plants, with respect to our astral body we are of the same nature as animals. Plants exist in a continuous state of sleep. If we do not judge these things accurately, it is easy to fall into the error of crediting plants with a consciousness similar to what animals and humans have in the waking state. This error is only possible if we form an inexact concept of consciousness. When an external stimulus is applied to a plant, it makes certain movements, just as an animal would do. We can say that plants whose leaves curl up under certain external stimuli are quote-unquote sensitive to these stimuli. The deciding factor in consciousness, however, is not the fact that a being responds to stimuli, but the fact that it inwardly experiences something new in addition to the mere response. Otherwise, we would also be able to speak of consciousness when a piece of iron expands under the influence of heat. Consciousness is only present when the being in question has an inner experience, of pain, for example, as a result of the heat's effect. The fourth element that supersensible cognition ascribes to our human makeup has nothing in common with the manifest world that surrounds us. It is what distinguishes us from our fellow creatures, and makes us the crown of creation, of the created world that belongs to us, at least temporarily. Supersensible cognition forms a concept of this next part of our human makeup by pointing out essential differences among our waking experiences. These differences immediately become apparent when we turn our attention to the fact that in the waking state we are constantly in the midst of experiences that are necessarily transient, while on the other hand we also have experiences of which this is not true. This difference becomes especially clear when we compare our human experiences to those of animals. Animals experience the influences of the outer world with great regularity, under the influence of the warmth and the cold, of pain and pleasure, and certain regularly recurrent processes in their bodies. They become aware of hunger and thirst. Such experiences do not constitute the entire scope of our human life. We can develop desires and wishes that transcend all this. It would always be possible, if we were able to go far enough, to demonstrate where the cause of an animal's action or sensation lies, whether within its body or outside of it. This is by no means the case with human beings. We can produce wishes and desires that are not adequately accounted for by causes either within or outside of our bodies. We must acknowledge that everything falling into this domain has a special source. In spiritual scientific terms, this source can be seen in the human quote-unquote I, capital letter I, which can therefore be called the fourth part of our human makeup. If the astral body were left to its own devices, pleasure and pain and sensations of hunger and thirst would take place in it, but there would be no sense of anything permanent in all of this. What we are calling the I is not the permanent factor itself, but what experiences permanency. In this field, we must formulate our concepts very clearly so that no misunderstandings arise. When we become aware of something lasting or permanent within the changing flow of our inner experiences, the feeling of I begins to dawn on us. The fact that a being feels hunger, for instance, cannot give it a feeling of I. Hunger sets in when its recurrent causes make themselves felt in the being in question, which then attacks its food with gusto simply because these recurrent causes are present. The feeling of I does not appear when recurrent causes of hunger drive us to seek food. It appears when, in addition to this, we retain an awareness of our pleasure on a previous occasion when our hunger was satisfied, so that our desire for food is driven by past experience as well as by our current experience of hunger. The physical body would fall apart if the ether body did not hold it together. The ether body would sink into unconsciousness if the astral body did not illumine it. Likewise, the astral body would repeatedly forget the past if the I did not rescue this past and carry it over into the present. What death is to the physical body and sleep to the ether body, forgetting is to the astral body. We can also say that life belongs to the ether body, consciousness to the astral body, and memory to the I. Falling into the error of ascribing memory to animals is even easier than ascribing consciousness to plants. It is natural to think of memory when a dog recognizes its owners, after perhaps not having seen them for a long time. In reality, however, this recognition is not based on memory, but on something totally different. The dog feels a certain attraction for its owners, which proceeds from their very being. This gives the dog pleasure when its owners are present. Each time they are again present after an absence, the dog's pleasure recurs. Memory, however, is only present when a being not only feels its experiences in the present, but also retains those of the past. Even if we acknowledge this, we might still fall into the error of thinking that the dog remembers. We could say, for instance, that since the dog grieves when its owners leave, it retains a memory of them. This, too, is an incorrect assessment of the situation. Through sharing life with its owners, the dog comes to need their presence and thus feels their absence in the same way that it feels hunger. If we do not make such distinctions, life's true circumstances will not become clear to us. Certain biases might make us object to this presentation and say that we cannot know whether or not anything similar to human memory is present in animals. This objection is based on untrained observation. If we are really capable of observing factually how an animal behaves in the context of its experiences, we will notice the difference between its behavior and that of a human being, and will realize that the animal's behavior is in keeping with the absence of memory. This fact is immediately clear to supersensible observation. But in addition, the effects of what enters human consciousness directly during supersensible observation enable our thought-permeated sensory perception to recognize it. If we say that we become aware of our own memory by inwardly observing our own souls, while we cannot do the same with the soul of an animal, this statement is based on a fateful error. What we can say about our own capacity for memory does not come from inwardly observing our souls, but only from what we experience with regard to ourselves in relationship to the objects and processes of the outer world. We experience this with regard to ourselves, with regard to other human beings, and also with regard to animals in exactly the same way. We are blinded by illusion when we believe that we assess the presence of memory only on the basis of inner observation. Although we may say that the power that underlies memory is an inner power, our assessment of it, even with regard to ourselves, is acquired from the outer world by looking at the context of life. We are able to assess this context with regard to an animal in the same way that we can assess it with regard to ourselves. Contemporary psychology suffers a great deal in this respect from its totally untrained and inexact ideas, which are highly deceptive due to errors in observation. It would be very easy to misunderstand this book's explanations of the faculty of memory. It will not be immediately apparent to people who consider only outer processes that there is a difference between what happens in memory-like occurrences in animals or even in plants and what is described here as real memory in human beings. It is true that when an animal does something for the third or fourth time, to all outer appearances it may well seem that memory and the learning associated with it are actually present. Like some natural scientists and their followers, we might even extend the concept of memory to include what happens when a chick creeps out of its shell and begins pecking at grain. It even knows the precise movements it needs to make with its head and body in order to do this. We might say that since it cannot have learned this while still in the shell, it must have learned it from the thousands and thousands of creatures who were its ancestors. This is what hearing says, for example, footnote 3, Ewald Hearing, 1834 to 1918, let me try the German, über das Gedächtnis als eine allgemeine Funktion der organisierten Materie. Materie, maybe. Sorry, I guess there is an English here, quote, memory as a general function of organized matter, Vienna, 1870. End footnote. It is quite possible to describe this phenomenon as something that looks like memory. But if we do not consider the unique process that takes place in human beings, which is a process of really perceiving earlier experiences at later points in time, rather than merely a process by which earlier conditions influence later ones, we will never be able to really grasp the essence of human nature. In this book, the perception of the past, and not merely its reappearance, even in a changed form at a later time, is what will be called memory. If we chose to use this word for the corresponding processes in the plant and animal kingdoms, we would need to have another one to apply to human beings. The word itself is not what is important in the discussion above. What is important is that with regard to understanding the essential nature of the human being, we must recognize the difference. It is equally impossible to relate the apparently highly intelligent accomplishments of animals to what is being called memory here. For the I, remembering and forgetting signify something very similar to what waking and sleeping signify for the astral body. Just as sleep allows the cares and troubles of the day to disappear into nothingness, forgetting spreads a veil over life's bad experiences, blotting out part of the past. And just as we need sleep to strengthen our exhausted life forces again, we also need to eradicate certain parts of our past from our memory in order to approach new experiences freely and without bias. Forgetting is precisely what develops our strength to perceive something new. Think about things like learning how to write, for instance. All the detailed steps that children have to go through in learning how to write are forgotten, and what remains is the ability to write. How could we possibly write if all our past experiences of learning how to do it arose again in our souls as memories each time we put pen to paper? Now, memory appears in various stages. Its simplest form is when we perceive an object and can then turn away from it and reawaken a mental image of it. This mental image was formed while we were perceiving the object, in a process that took place between our astral body and our eye. The astral body made the outer impression of the object become conscious. But we would have been aware of the object only for as long as it was actually present if the eye had not absorbed this knowledge and taken possession of it. This is the point where supersensible observation separates our bodily nature from our soul nature. We speak of the astral body as long as we have in mind the birth of knowledge about an object that is present. What gives permanence to this knowledge, however, we then call the soul. But from what has just been said, we can immediately see how closely the human astral body is linked to the part of the soul that gives permanence to knowledge. These two things are united into a single element of our human makeup, so to speak, and therefore this union can also be called the astral body. If we want exact terms, we can also call the human astral body the soul body, and the soul, to the extent that it is united with this soul body, the sentient soul. The I rises to a higher level of its essential nature when it directs its activity to the aspects of this object knowledge that it has made its own. Through this activity, the I detaches itself more and more from perceived objects in order to work within what it has made its own. The part of the soul where this happens can be called the intellectual soul or mind soul. It is characteristic of both the sentient and mind souls that they work with what they receive through impressions of objects perceived by the senses and then retained in memory. Here the soul is totally given over to something external to it. Even what it takes possession of through memory has been received from outside. I'm going to read that paragraph again. The I rises to a higher level of its essential nature when it directs its activity toward the aspects of this object knowledge that it has made its own. Through this activity, the I detaches itself more and more from perceived objects in order to work within what it has made its own. The part of the soul where this happens can be called the intellectual soul or mind soul. It is characteristic of both the sentient and mind souls that they work with what they receive through impressions of objects perceived by the senses and then retained in memory. Here, the soul is totally given over to something external to it. Even what it takes possession of through memory has been received from outside. However, the soul can transcend all this. It consists of more than just the sentient and mind souls. It is easiest for the supersensible view to provide some idea of this by pointing to a single, simple fact whose comprehensive significance needs to be appreciated. Within the entire scope of our language, there is only one name whose essential character distinguishes it from all others. That name is capital I. Any other name can be applied to the thing or being to whom it belongs by any human being. But as a designation for a being, I has meaning only when that being applies it to itself. The name I can never be heard coming from outside as the name of the listener. One can only apply it to oneself. I am an I, only to myself. I am you to anyone else, and anyone else is a you to me. This state of affairs is the outward expression of a deeply significant truth. The actual essential nature of the I is independent of anything external. Therefore, nothing outside of it can call it by its name. Religious denominations that have consciously maintained their connection to the supersensible view call the term I the quote-unquote ineffable name of God. This points to what has just been indicated. Nothing external has access to the part of the human soul we are looking at now. This is the soul's quote-unquote hidden shrine, and only a being that is of the same nature as the soul can gain entrance there. The God who dwells within the human being begins to speak when the soul recognizes itself as an I. Just as the sentient and mind souls dwell in the outer world, a third soul element immerses itself in the divine when the soul achieves perception of its own being. It is easy to misunderstand this view as a declaration that the I and God are one and the same. However, it does not state that the I is God, but only that it is of the same character and essence as the divine. If we took a drop of water out of the sea, would we be claiming that it is the sea if we said that the drop is of the same essence or substance as the sea? If we absolutely want to use a comparison, we can say that the drop is to the sea as the I is to the divine. We can find a divine element in ourselves because our own primal being is taken from the divine. Thus, through this third part of the human soul, we acquire inner knowledge of ourselves, just as we acquire knowledge of the outer world through the astral body. This is why esoteric science can call this third soul element the consciousness soul. In an esoteric scientific sense, the soul consists of three parts: the sentient soul, the mind soul, and the consciousness soul, just as the body consists of three parts: the physical body, the ether body, and the astral body. Psychological errors in observation, similar to those already mentioned regarding the erroneous assessment of the capacity for memory, make it difficult to acquire the right kind of insight into the essential nature of the I. Many things we believe we understand can seem to refute what is presented above, while in reality they confirm it. This is the case, for example, with Edward von Hartmann, his comments on the I in his Outline of Psychology. Quote, "In the first place, self-awareness is older than the word I. Personal pronouns are a rather late product of the evolution of languages. They are of value to language only as abbreviations. The word I is a shorter substitute for the speaker's own name, but a substitute that each speaker as such uses for him or herself, regardless of what proper name others may apply to him or her. Self-awareness can develop to a very great extent in animals and in untaught people with severe speech and hearing impairments, even without reference to a proper name. Awareness of one's own name can fully replace the absence of the use of the word I. This insight eliminates the magical aura that envelops the little word I in the minds of many people. This word cannot contribute in the least to the concept of self-awareness. Rather, it receives its entire content from that concept." End of quote. Footnote. For Edward von Hartmann, 1842 to 1906. Try the German again. System der Philosophie im Grundriss. That's parenthesis, an outline of a system of philosophy, parenthesis, volume 3. Also Grundriss der Psychologie, parenthesis, an outline of psychology, parenthesis, end footnote. We can agree completely with such views. We can also agree that no magical aura should be attached to the little word I to darken our thoughtful consideration of the matter. But the nature of a thing is not determined by how gradually the word designating it came about. The important point is that the essential being of the I in self-awareness is, quote, older than the word I, unquote, and that we are compelled to use this particular little word, endowed with qualities belonging to it alone, for the element in our interrelationship with the outer world that is different from what an animal can experience. Nothing can be shown about the nature of a triangle by showing how the word, quote-unquote, triangle came about. Similarly, nothing can be concluded about the nature of the I by knowing how the word developed out of a different verbal usage in the course of the evolution of language. The true nature of the I first reveals itself in the consciousness soul. The soul loses itself to other things in feeling and intellect, but as the consciousness soul it takes hold of its own being. That's why the consciousness soul's perception of the I can take place only through a certain inner activity. Mental images of outer objects, formed as these objects come and go, work on in our intellect through a power of their own. However, if the I is to perceive itself, it cannot simply surrender itself. In order to be conscious of its own being, it must first use inner activity to lift its being up out of its own depths. When the I is perceived, that is, when self-reflection takes place, an inner activity of the I begins. Through this activity, perceiving the I in the consciousness soul acquires a quite different meaning for the human being than perceiving everything that approaches us through our three bodily elements and the other two parts of the soul. The force that makes the I manifest in the consciousness soul is actually the same force that makes itself known in all the rest of the world, but in the body and in the lower soul elements it does not appear directly, but reveals itself in stages through its effects. Its lowest manifestation takes place through the physical body. It then rises step by step to what fills the mind soul. We might say that at each step in its ascent, another veil cloaking the hidden element falls away. In what fills the consciousness soul, this hidden element steps unveiled into the innermost temple of the soul, where it appears as only a drop in the sea of all-pervading spirituality. Here, however, we must first take hold of this spirituality. We must recognize it in ourselves, so that we are then also able to find it in its manifestations. What makes its way like a drop into the consciousness soul is called the spirit by esoteric science. In this way, the consciousness soul is united with the spirit, which is the hidden element in everything manifest. When we want to grasp the Spirit in all the revealed world, we must do so in the same way that we grasp the I in the consciousness soul. The activity that led us to perceive this I must now be directed toward the manifest world. In doing this, we evolve to higher levels of our being and add something new to the body and soul elements of our human makeup. To begin with, we conquer what lies hidden in the lower parts of the soul. This takes place through work on the soul that proceeds from the I. How a person is involved in this work becomes evident when we compare a noble idealist to someone who is still totally given up to lower desires and so-called sensual pleasures. Such a person can become a quote-unquote noble idealist by withdrawing from certain base inclinations and turning toward higher ones. That is, by working out of the I to have an ennobling and spiritualizing effect on his or her own soul. The I becomes the master within that person's soul life. This can be taken to the point where no desire or craving can take place in the soul unless the I allows it to enter. In this way, the entire soul becomes a revelation of the I, as was previously true only of the consciousness soul. Fundamentally, all of our cultural activity and spiritual endeavors consist of work that aims for this mastery by the I. All human beings who are alive at present are involved in this work, whether or not they choose to be, and whether or not they are conscious of it. But this work leads to higher levels of our essential human nature and develops new parts of our makeup that are hidden behind what is manifest to us. Not only can we master the soul by working on it out of the I so that it reveals what is hidden in the manifest, but we can also take this work further and extend it to the astral body. The I then takes possession of the astral body by uniting with its hidden nature. This astral body that is conquered and transformed by the I can be called the spirit self. Parenthesis, this is the same as what is called manas, M-A-N-A-S, in the traditions of Eastern wisdom, parenthesis. The spirit self constitutes a higher element of our human makeup, one that is present in it in embryonic form, as it were, and emerges more and more in the course of working on ourselves. Just as we conquer the astral body by making our way through to the hidden forces standing behind it, this also happens with the ether body in the course of our inner development. Working on the ether body, however, is more intensive than working on the astral body, because what is concealed in the ether body is cloaked in two veils, while what is hidden in the astral is cloaked in only a single veil. We can get an idea of the differences in working on each of these two bodies by pointing to certain changes that can take place in us in the course of our development. First, let's think about how certain soul qualities develop when the I works on the soul, how passion and desire, joy and sorrow may change. All we need to do is think back to our childhood. What gave us pleasure then? What caused us pain? What have we learned? What have we added to what we were able to do as children? All of this is only an expression of how the I gained mastery over the astral body, because the astral body is the vehicle of passion and sorrow, of joy and pain. In contrast, there are certain other qualities of ours, such as our temperament and the deeper idiosyncrasies of our character, that change relatively little over time. Someone who was hot-tempered as a child will often retain certain aspects of this violent temper in later life. This point is so striking that there are theorists who totally deny the possibility of any fundamental change in a person's character. They assume that this remains constant throughout a person's life, simply revealing itself in one direction or another. However, this conclusion is based on lack of observation. It is clear to anyone who has the capacity to observe such things that even a person's character and temperament change under the influence of the I, although this change is slow in comparison to the change in the qualities described above. To use a comparison, the relationship between the two kinds of change is like the movement of the hour hand of a clock in relationship to the minute hand. Now, the forces that bring about changes in a person's character or temperament belong to the hidden domain of the ether body. They are of the same nature as the forces that govern the living kingdom, that is, the forces that serve the processes of growth, nutrition, and reproduction. Examples that will be presented later on in this book will shed the right light on these things. It is not possible to draw a fixed boundary between the changes that take place as a result of the activity of the I in the astral body and those that take place in the ether body, since they blend into each other. If something we learn enhances our faculty of judgment, a change has taken place in the astral body. But if this judgment changes our state of mind so that we become accustomed to feeling differently about a subject after having learned about it, then a change has taken place in the ether body. Everything we take possession of in such a way that we can recall it again and again is based on a change in the ether body. Anything that gradually becomes an entrenched part of the wealth of our memory rests on the fact that the work performed on the astral body has been transferred to the ether body. The I is not working on the astral body when we simply give ourselves up to pleasure and suffering, joy and pain, but only when the idiosyncrasies of these soul qualities begin to change. Likewise, this work extends to the ether body when our I applies its activity to changing our traits of character, our temperament, and so on. Every individual is working on this change too, whether consciously or not. In ordinary life, the strongest impulses working on behalf of this change are religious ones. When our I allows impulses that flow from religion to work on it again and again, these impulses develop a strength within the I that works right through into the ether body and transforms it, just as lesser impulses in life cause a transformation of the astral body. These lesser impulses, which come to us through learning, thinking, ennobling our feelings, and so on, are subject to the many and various changes in our life, but religious feelings leave a uniform imprint on all our thinking, feeling, and willing. They shed a common, uniform light on our whole soul life, so to speak. We think and feel one way today, another way tomorrow, prompted by a great variety of causes. But if, because of religious feelings of whatever sort, we divine the presence of something that remains constant through all these changes, we will relate both today's and tomorrow's soul experiences to this fundamental feeling. Religious life, therefore, has a far-reaching effect on our soul life that becomes stronger and stronger with time because it works through constant repetition. That is why it acquires the strength to work on our ether body. True art has similar effects on us. If through the outer form, color, or tone of a work of art we are able to penetrate to its spiritual foundation with our thought and feeling, then the impulses our I receives as a result actually work right through to the ether body. If we think this thought through to its conclusion, we can assess art's tremendous significance for all of human development and evolution. We have referred here to only a few examples of things that provide the I with impulses to work on the ether body. There are many such influences in our lives that are not so readily apparent to the observing eye as the ones that have been mentioned here. From these, however, it is evident that there is an additional part of our human makeup hidden within us, and that the I is gradually developing it. We can call this second spiritual element the life spirit. Parenthesis, this is the same as what is called Buddhi, B-U-D-D-H-I, in the traditions of Eastern wisdom. Parenthesis. Life spirit is the appropriate term for this, because the forces active within it are the same forces that are active in the life body. The only difference is that when they manifest as the life body, the human I is not active in them. However, when they manifest as the life spirit, they are imbued with the activity of the I. Our intellectual development and the extent to which we purify and ennoble our displays of feeling and will are the measure of our transformation of the astral body into the spirit self, while religious and other related experiences leave an imprint on our ether body and turn it into the life spirit. In the course of ordinary life, this happens more or less unconsciously. In contrast, in what is known as initiation, supersensible knowledge points out the means that allow us to take this work on the spirit self and life spirit quite consciously in hand. These means will be discussed in later sections of this book. For the moment, the most important thing is simply to show that in addition to the body and the soul, the spirit is also active within the human being. Later we will also see how this spirit belongs to the human being's eternal aspect, in contrast to the transitory body. The activity of the eye, however, is not limited to working on the astral body and the ether body. It also extends to the physical body. A trace of the influence of the eye can be seen, for instance, when a person blushes or turns pale under certain circumstances. In this case, the eye actually triggers a process in the physical body. When changes take place in a person through the activity of the eye, specifically with regard to its influence on the physical body, the eye is actually united with the physical body's hidden forces, with the same forces that bring about physical processes in it. We can then say that the eye is working on the physical body through this activity. This statement must not be misunderstood. We must not assume that this work is something crudely material. What appears in a crudely material way in the physical body is only the manifest aspect of this work. Its essential forces are spiritual in nature and lie hidden behind this manifestation. We are not speaking here of work on the physical body's manifest material aspect, but of spiritual work on the invisible forces that bring the body into existence and later cause it to disintegrate again. In ordinary life, the work of the eye on the physical body enters our consciousness to only a very limited degree of clarity. We arrive at complete clarity only when we take this work consciously in hand under the influence of supersensible knowledge. At that point, however, it becomes apparent that there is a third spiritual part to the human being. This may be called the spirit body, in contrast to the physical human body. Parenthesis, in Eastern wisdom, the spirit body is called the Atma, A-T-M-A, parenthesis. It is also easy to be misled with regard to the spirit body, because we view the physical body as the human being's lowest component and therefore have difficulty coming to terms with the fact that working on this physical body is supposed to result in the highest part of our human makeup. But the very fact that the physical body conceals the spirit active in it behind 3 veils is the reason why the highest form of inner work is needed to unite the eye with the spirit hidden there. Thus the human being appears to esoteric science as a being made up of different elements. Those of a bodily nature are the physical body, the ether body, and the astral body. Those belonging to the soul are the sentient soul, the mind soul, and the consciousness soul. The light of the eye shines forth within the soul. The spiritual elements are the spirit self, the life spirit, and the spirit body. It follows from the descriptions above that the sentient soul and the astral body are closely united and constitute a unity in a certain respect. Likewise, the consciousness soul and the spirit self constitute a unity, because the consciousness soul is where the spirit flares up and radiates outward into the other parts of our human makeup. Taking this into consideration, we can speak of the following configuration of the human being. The astral body and the sentient soul can be combined into a single element, as can the consciousness soul and the spirit self. We can simply call the mind soul the I, because it takes part in the nature of the I. In a certain respect, it already is the I that has not yet become aware of its spiritual nature. This results in 7 components of the human being. Number 1, the physical body. Number 2, the ether body or life body. Number 3, the astral body. Number 4, the I. Number 5, the spirit self. Number 6, the life spirit. Number 7, the spirit body. This 7-fold configuration of the human being need not have anything vaguely magical about it, as people who are used to materialistic concepts so often claim, if these people would simply stick closely to the meaning of the descriptions above, and not superimpose this element of magic from the very beginning. We ought to speak of these 7 parts of the human being no differently from how we speak of the 7 colors that make up light, or the 7 notes that constitute a scale, parenthesis, if we consider the octave to be a repetition of the tonic, parenthesis. The only difference is that we are speaking from the viewpoint of a higher method of observing the world. Just as light appears in 7 colors and sound in a 7-fold scale, homogeneous human nature appears in the 7 differentiations described above. Just as there is nothing inherently superstitious about the number 7 in tone and color, this is also the case with regard to differentiation in the human being. Parenthesis, during one oral presentation on this subject, someone remarked that in the case of colors, the number 7 is not correct, because there are other colors, invisible to the eye, that lie beyond red and violet. Even taking this into account, however, the analogy to colors holds good, because our human makeup actually extends beyond the physical body on the one hand and the spirit body on the other. These extensions, however, are quote-unquote spiritually invisible to methods of supersensible observation, just as the colors beyond red and violet are invisible to the physical eye. It was necessary to respond to this remark, because it is so easy to think that supersensible observation is amateurish and imprecise in how it uses ideas from the natural sciences. However, anyone who pays strict attention to the intended meaning of what is said here will find that it actually never contradicts true natural science, neither when natural scientific facts are used for purposes of illustration, nor when remarks made here point to a direct relationship to natural scientific research. Parenthesis, end of chapter 2. Chapter 3 of the book by Rudolf Steiner entitled An Outline of Esoteric Science, entitled Sleep and Death. Just as we cannot solve the riddle of life without considering death, we also cannot break through to understanding the essence of waking consciousness without considering the state we pass through during sleep. Someone who has no feeling for the significance of supersensible knowledge may entertain doubts about this knowledge, simply because of its views on sleep and death. We can appreciate the reason for these doubts. There is nothing incomprehensible about it if someone states that human beings are here in order to lead an active and effective life, that purposeful activity depends on being able to devote ourselves to this life, and that delving into conditions like sleep and death can result only from a penchant for idle dreaminess and lead only to empty fantasies. It is easy for people to believe that rejecting such fantasies is a sign of a healthy soul, and that devoting oneself to idle dreaminess is a pathological trait that is present only in people who lack both joy in life and the strength to tackle it, and who are incapable of real purposeful activity. It would be doing this opinion an injustice to present it as totally false, because there is a certain kernel of truth in it. It is a quarter truth that needs the other 3/4 for completeness. If we attack the 1/4 of it that is true, we will simply arouse the suspicions of those who see that quarter very nearly, very clearly, but have no inkling of the other 3. It must be acknowledged without reservation that investigating what is hidden behind the veils of sleep and death actually is pathological if it leads to weakness and estrangement from real life. Likewise, we must agree that much of what called itself esoteric science in the past, as well as much of what is practiced today under that name, bears the imprint of something unhealthy and hostile to life. But this unhealthy element does not spring from true supersensible knowledge. On the contrary, the real fact of the matter is this: just as we cannot always be awake when it comes to the real circumstances of life in the broadest sense, we also cannot get along without what the supersensible element can offer us. Life continues while we are asleep, and our forces for the working and creating we do while we are awake gain strength and refreshment from what sleep gives them. This is how things stand with what we can observe in the manifest world. But the world is broader in scope than that particular field of observation. And what we know in the visible world must be complemented and fructified by what can be known about the invisible worlds. If we did not repeatedly draw strength for our depleted forces from sleep, we would destroy our life. Similarly, a worldview not fructified by a knowledge of the hidden element inevitably leads to desolation. Something similar is true of death. Living things succumb to death so that new life can come about. Knowledge of the supersensible element is precisely what can shed light on Goethe's beautiful words, quote, "Life is nature's most beautiful invention, and death is a trick it plays in order to have abundant life." In quotation footnote, an aphorism on nature in Goethe's Naturwissenschaftlichen Schriften, works on natural science, edited with commentary by Rudolf Штайнер in Kirchner's Deutsche Nationalliteratur, National Literature, Germany, 5 volumes, 1884 to 1897. In footnote. Just as there would be no life in the usual sense of the word if there were no death, there can be no real knowledge of the visible world without insight into the supersensible realm. All knowledge of the visible must immerse itself in the invisible again and again in order to be able to evolve. Thus it is evident that the science of the supersensible is what makes the existence of revealed knowledge altogether possible. When it appears in its true form, this science of the invisible never weakens life. It repeatedly strengthens it and makes it fresh and healthy when it has become weak and sick from having been left on its own. When we fall asleep, the connection between the elements of our makeup changes. The part of a human being that lies sleeping on the bed contains the physical body and ether body, but not the astral body or ego. Life's processes continue during sleep because the ether body remains united with the physical body. If the physical body were left to itself, it would have to disintegrate. What is extinguished in sleep, however, are our mental images, our pain and pleasure, joy and sorrow, our ability to express our conscious intentions, and similar realities of our existence. The astral body is the vehicle of all these, however. If we are unbiased in our assessment of this situation, we will never be able to entertain the notion that the astral body is destroyed during sleep, along with all our pleasure and pain and the entire world of our ideas and will. It is simply present in a different state. For our eye and astral body to have a conscious perception of our pain and suffering and all the other things just listed, rather than simply being filled with them, the astral body must be connected to the physical body and the ether body. And in fact it is connected when we are awake, but not when we are asleep. In sleep the astral body withdraws. It takes on a different form of existence than the one it has when it is connected to the physical and ether bodies. So the next task for supersensible knowledge is to consider the astral body's other form of existence. As far as observation in the external world is concerned, the astral body disappears during sleep. Now, supersensible perception's job is to follow it until it takes possession of the physical and ether bodies once again when we wake up. As in all cases involving knowledge of the world's hidden things and processes, discovering the particulars of what is really going on in the state of sleep requires supersensible observation. Once what can be discovered by this means has been stated, however, it is immediately understandable to truly unbiased thinking, because processes in the hidden world have effects that are visible in the manifest world. Once we see how the contribution of supersensible observation makes sense-perceptible processes understandable, such corroboration by life itself constitutes the proof that can be required for such things. Those who choose not to use the methods of attaining supersensible perception that will be explained later will still be able to have the experience of accepting the statements of supersensible knowledge and applying them to manifest things in their own experience. By doing so, they will find that life becomes clear and understandable. The more precisely and thoroughly they consider ordinary life, the more they will come to this conviction. Even though the astral body experiences no mental images during sleep, no pleasure or pain or anything similar, it does not remain inactive. On the contrary, it is obliged to maintain a lively activity in the sleeping state, an activity it must take up again and again in rhythmical succession after periods of being involved in the activity that it shares with the physical and ether bodies. Just as the pendulum of a clock that has swung to the left and then comes back to the middle must then swing to the right because of the momentum gained by swinging to the left, the astral body and the I that rests in its bosom, having been active for a while in the physical and ether bodies, must then spend the next period of time being busy and active in the body-free state, in an environment of soul and spirit. As far as our normal state of life is concerned, unconsciousness sets in when the astral body and the I are in this body-free state, because this represents the counterbalance to the state of consciousness that develops in the waking state through union with the physical and ether bodies, just as the pendulum's swing to the right is the counterbalance to its swing to the left. The sole spiritual principle in the human being experiences needing to enter this state of unconsciousness as fatigue. However, this fatigue is the expression of the fact that during sleep the astral body and I are preparing themselves to reform during the next period of wakefulness what has arisen in the physical and ether bodies through purely organic and unconscious formative activity, while they were free of the spirit and soul principles. This unconscious formative activity is the polar opposite of what happens in the human being during consciousness and by means of consciousness. These states must alternate in rhythmical succession. The usual view on the connection between sleep and fatigue are not in line with the facts. We think that sleep sets in as a consequence of fatigue. This is an oversimplified idea, as is shown by the fact that people often fall asleep during uninteresting lectures or on other similar occasions, even if they aren't tired at all. Anyone who insists that such occasions make us tired is trying to explain this phenomenon by applying a method that lacks cognitive integrity. Unbiased observation will certainly show us that waking and sleeping represent different relationships of the soul to the body. Like a pendulum swinging alternately to the right and to the left, these relationships alternate in rhythmic succession in the ordinary course of life. This same unbiased observation reveals that the state of being filled with impressions of the outer world awakens within the soul a desire to follow this state with a different one, in which the soul is absorbed in enjoying its own bodily nature. Two states of soul alternate, surrendering to outer impressions and surrendering to one's own bodily nature. During the first state, the desire for the second is produced unconsciously. The second state then runs its course in unconsciousness. Fatigue is the expression of wanting to enjoy our own bodily nature. So, instead of saying that we want to sleep because we feel tired, we actually ought to say that we feel tired because we want to sleep. Since the human soul can, as a sort of adaptation, evoke at will states that normally appear as a matter of necessity, it is also possible for us to evoke the desire to enjoy our own bodily nature when we have numbed ourselves to a given outer impression. That is, we fall asleep, even though our inner condition gives us no reason to do so. The physical body can only be maintained in a shape and form suitable for a human being by means of a human ether body, which must in turn receive the appropriate forces from an astral body. The ether body is the sculptor or architect of the physical body. However, it can only shape the body in the right way if it receives the stimulus to do so from the astral body. The astral body contains the prototypes, according to which the ether body gives the physical body its form. During the waking state, the astral body is not filled with these prototypes of the physical body, or only to a certain extent, because the soul puts images of its own in their place. When we direct our senses to our surroundings, we form mental images by means of perception, mental images that are likenesses of the world around us. Initially, these likenesses disturb the images that stimulate the ether body to maintain the physical body. If our own activity were to supply our astral body with images that would stimulate the ether body in the right way, this disturbance would not happen. In fact, however, this disturbance, which is expressed in the fact that the prototypes for the ether body are not fully effective during the waking state, plays an important role in human existence. In the waking state, the astral body carries out its activity within the physical body, while in sleep it works upon it from outside. Just as the physical body, which is of the same nature as the outer world, needs the outer world to supply it with nourishment, for example, something similar is also true of the astral body. Imagine a physical human body removed from the world that surrounds it. It would have to perish. This demonstrates that without its whole physical environment, it could not exist. In fact, the entire earth must be just the way it is if physical human bodies are to exist on it. In reality, the entire human body is simply a part of the earth, or, in a wider sense, part of the whole physical universe. In this connection, its relationship is similar to that of a finger on one hand to the entire human body. If we sever the finger from the hand, it can no longer remain a finger. It withers away. The same thing would happen to a human body if it were removed from the body it is part of, from the living conditions provided by the earth. If we were to raise it a sufficient number of miles above the earth's surface, it would die, just as a finger severed from the hand dies. If we pay less attention to this fact with regard to our own physical bodies than with regard to fingers, this is simply because fingers cannot stroll around freely on the body the way people can on the earth, so the dependence of fingers is more obvious. Just as the physical body is embedded in the physical world to which it belongs, the astral body is also embedded in a world of its own. However, it is torn out of this world during our waking life. An analogy will illustrate what happens in this case. Imagine a container full of water. A single drop in this volume of water is not something separate and independent. But then, suppose we take a little sponge and absorb one drop out of the whole amount. Something similar happens with the human astral body when we wake up. During sleep, it is in a world that is like itself. In a certain sense, it constitutes something belonging to that world. But when we wake up, the physical body and the ether body absorb it and fill themselves with it. They contain the organs through which it perceives the outer world. But in order to acquire this perception, it must separate itself from the other world to which it belongs. However, it can only receive the prototypes it needs for the ether world from this other world. In the sleeping state, the astral body receives images from the world that surrounds it, just as the physical body receives nourishment from its surroundings. For example, the astral body actually lives out there in the universe, outside the physical and ether bodies, in the same universe that gave birth to the entire human being. This universe is the source of the images we use to maintain our form, and we are harmoniously incorporated into it during sleep. As we awaken, we lift ourselves up out of this all-encompassing harmony in order to acquire outer perception. During sleep, our astral bodies return to the harmony of the universe again. When we awaken, we bring enough strength with us out of the cosmic harmony into our bodies so that we can go without being in that state for a while. The astral body returns home during sleep and brings renewed forces back into our life when we awaken. The outer expression of this is the refreshment that healthy sleep bestows on us. Further esoteric scientific descriptions will show that the astral body's home is more encompassing than the aspect of the physical environment that belongs to the physical body in the narrower sense. While we humans, as physical beings, are part of the earth, our astral bodies are part of a world that embraces additional heavenly bodies. During sleep, therefore, we enter a world that encompasses other worlds in addition to our earth. As mentioned before, this fact will only become clear from later descriptions. It ought to be superfluous to point to a misunderstanding that can easily arise with regard to these facts, but this is not the case in an age when certain materialistic ways of thinking are present. Of course, people who subscribe to these views can say that the only scientific thing to do is to investigate the physical conditions of something such as sleep. They can say that even though experts are not yet united on the subject of the physical cause of sleep, one thing is certain: we must assume that specific physical processes are the basis of this phenomenon. If only people would admit that supersensible knowledge in no way contradicts this claim. It agrees with everything that is said from this point of view, just as we all agree that in the physical construction of a house, one brick must be placed on top of another, and that when the house is finished, its structure and the fact that it holds together can be explained in terms of purely mechanical laws. In order for the house to come about, however, the architect's idea is needed, and this idea is nowhere to be found when we investigate only the physical laws that apply. Just as the thoughts of the person who created the house lie behind the physical laws that make it explainable, the statements of supersensible knowledge also lie behind what physical science quite correctly presents. It is true that this comparison, which may be considered trivial, is often used to justify the idea of a spiritual backdrop to the world, but in such matters the important thing is not that we are familiar with specific concepts, but that we attach the right value to them in arguing the point. The mere fact that opposing ideas exercise so much power over our capacity for judgment can prevent us from assessing this value correctly. Dreaming is an intermediate state between waking and sleeping. To thoughtful consideration, dream experiences consist of a colorful intermingling of images in a world that conceals an element of regularity and lawfulness within it, although at first glance this world seems to reveal an often confusing ebb and flow. In dreaming, we are released from the laws of waking consciousness that fetter us to sensory perception and to the rules that govern our power of judgment. And yet, dreams obey certain mysterious laws that are fascinating and alluring to our faculty of surmising, and are the deeper reason why we so readily compare dreaming to the beautiful play of imagination that supports artistic sensitivity. We will find this confirmed if we simply recall a few characteristic dreams. We dream, for example, about driving off a dog that is about to pounce on us. We wake up to catch ourselves in the unconscious act of throwing off the covers where they were weighing on an unaccustomed body part and starting to bother us. What does dreaming do to a sense-perceptible process in this case? Our sleeping life allows what our senses would perceive in the waking state to remain fully unconscious for the moment. But it does hold fast to one essential thing, the fact that we are trying to get rid of something. It spins a pictorial process around this fact. The images, as such, are echoes of our daily waking life, but there is something arbitrary in the way they are borrowed from it. We have the feeling that although the same external provocation might also conjure up other pictures in our dream, these would still symbolically express the sensation of wanting to get rid of something. Dreams create symbols. They are symbolists. Inner processes can also be transformed into dream symbols. Suppose we dream that a fire is crackling nearby. We see the flames in our dream. We wake up and find that we have been too warmly covered and are getting hot. The feeling of too much warmth expresses itself in the dream image. Very dramatic experiences can be enacted in dreams. We dream, for instance, that we are standing at the edge of a cliff. We see a child running toward the edge. The dream lets us experience all our tormenting thoughts. If only the child would pay attention and not fall over the cliff. We see the child fall and hear a dull thud as the body lands. We wake up and find that something hanging on the bedroom wall has fallen down with a dull thump. In the dream, this simple process is expressed in exciting images. At the moment, we need not wonder about how it is possible for the momentary dull thud of a falling object to trigger a whole series of events that seemed to take place over a certain span of time. We only need to consider how the dream makes an image out of what sense perception would offer if we were awake. We see that as soon as our sensory activity comes to a halt, something creative asserts itself in us. This is the same creativity that is also present in completely dreamless sleep, where it appears as the soul state that is the opposite of the waking state. In order for this dreamless sleep to set in, the astral body must have withdrawn from the ether body and the physical body. During dreams, it is separated from the physical body in that it is no longer connected to our sense organs, but it still maintains a certain connection to the ether body. That we can perceive the astral body's processes in image form is due to this connection. When it ceases, the images immediately sink down into the darkness of the unconscious, and we have dreamless sleep. That dream pictures are arbitrary and often absurd is due to the fact that the astral body is not able to relate its images to the right objects and processes in our external surroundings, because it is separated from the physical body's sense organs. This state of affairs becomes much clearer when we consider a dream in which the I seems to split into two. For instance, when someone dreams of sitting in a classroom and being unable to answer a certain question, which the teacher then answers immediately. In this case, the dreamer cannot make use of the physical body's organs of perception, and is therefore not in a position to relate these two occurrences to one and the same person, namely his or herself. In order for each of us to recognize the enduring I in ourselves, we must first be equipped with organs of outer perception. This enduring I would only be perceptible to us outside the physical body if we had acquired the ability to become aware of it in some way other than through these organs of perception. It is up to supersensible consciousness to acquire the faculties needed for this. We will talk about the means of acquiring these faculties later on in this book. Death, too, occurs only because of a change in the relationship between the elements of our makeup. Here again the effects of what supersensible perception describes can be seen in the manifest world, and if our power of judgment is unbiased, we will be able to confirm the communications of supersensible knowledge by observing outer life. However, in this case the expression of the invisible in the visible is less apparent, and it is more difficult to fully recognize the significance of how the processes of outer life confirm what supersensible knowledge communicates. To those who refuse to understand how the sense perceptible contains a clear indication of the supersensible, claiming that these communications are mere figments of the imagination seems even more natural than saying the same of many things that have already been discussed in this book. During the transition to sleep, the astral body is simply released from its connection to the ether body and the physical body, which remain connected to each other. At death, however, the physical body also separates from the ether body. The physical body is given over to its own inherent forces. As a corpse, it must disintegrate. After death, the ether body, however, finds itself in a condition that it never experienced between birth and death, except under certain exceptional conditions that will be spoken of later. It is now united with the astral body, but without the presence of the physical body, because the ether and astral bodies do not separate from each other immediately after death. It is easy to understand the need for the force that holds them together for a time. If that force were not present, the ether body would not be able to extricate itself from the physical body at all. In sleep, for example, they are held together, and the astral body is incapable of tearing them apart. The requisite force takes effect at death, severing the ether body from the physical body, so that the ether body is now connected with the astral body. Supersensible observation shows that this connection is different in different people, but lasts for a matter of days. For the moment, this time period will be mentioned only as a point of information. Later, the astral body separates from its ether body and continues on its way without it. While these two bodies are still connected, we are in a state that allows us to perceive the experiences of our astral body. As long as the physical body is present, the work of restoring its worn-out organs must begin from outside as soon as the astral body is released from it, but once the physical body has been cast off, this work is no longer necessary. However, the force formerly used for this purpose during sleep persists after death and can now be used to make the astral body's own processes perceptible. If our processes of observation cling to life's externalities, we may still say that these are all claims that may be clear to those gifted with supersensible sight, but for everyone else there is no possibility of arriving at the truth of the matter. This is not the case. After supersensible knowledge discovers something in this or any other domain that is removed from ordinary perception, it can be grasped by our ordinary power of judgment. We must simply give the right consideration to relationships in life, in the manifest world. The relationships among thinking, feeling, and willing, and their relationship to our experiences in the outer world remain inherently incomprehensible as long as the character of their revealed activity is not seen as the expression of an unrevealed activity. This revealed activity becomes transparent to judgment only when the activity and the course it runs in the physical life of a human being can be seen as resulting from what supersensible knowledge concludes about non-physical things. If we confront this activity without benefit of supersensible knowledge, it is as if we were in a dark room with no light. Just as we see the physical objects in our surroundings only when light is present, what takes place in our soul life becomes explainable only in the presence of supersensible knowledge. As long as we are connected to the physical body, the outer world enters our consciousness in the form of images or reproductions. But after we cast that body off, we begin to perceive what our astral body experiences when it is not connected to the outer world by physical sense organs. At first, the astral body has no new experiences. Its connection to the ether body prevents it from experiencing anything new. However, it does possess a memory of the life that is just over. The still present ether body allows this memory to appear as a comprehensive living picture. So, our first experience after death is a perception of life between death and birth as a series of images spread out in front of us. During that life, memory was present only during the waking state, during union with our physical bodies, and only to the extent that these physical bodies permitted. But nothing that makes an impression on the soul during life is ever lost to it. If the physical body were the perfect instrument for this, it would be possible at any moment in life to make our entire life appear to the soul. At death, the physical body's hindrance disappears. As long as the ether body persists, a certain perfect memory is present, but this disappears to the extent that the ether body loses the form, similar to the physical body, that it had while dwelling in that body. This is also the reason why the astral body separates from the ether body after a while. It can only remain united with an ether body whose form still corresponds to the physical body. During life, between birth and death, the ether body separates from the physical body only in exceptional instances and only for brief periods. For example, a portion of the ether body can separate from the physical because of excessive pressure on one of our limbs. In this case, we say that the limb in question has, quote-unquote, gone to sleep. That peculiar feeling comes from the separation of the ether body. Parenthesis, of course, this is another opportunity for a materialistic view of things to deny the presence of the invisible in the visible, saying that this all stems from the physical disturbance caused by the pressure. Parenthesis. In a case like this, supersensible observation can see how the corresponding part of the ether body slips out of the physical. If a person experiences extreme fright or some similar unusual shock, the ether body may separate from the greater part of the physical body for a very short time. This happens if, for whatever reason, we suddenly find ourselves near death, on the verge of drowning, for example, or in danger of falling while rock climbing. The accounts of people who have experienced such things actually come very close to the truth and can be confirmed by supersensible observation. They state that in such moments their entire lives passed in front of their souls like a great picture in their memories. Of the many examples that could be given here, Only one will be referred to because it comes from a man whose personal philosophy would consider everything said about such things here to be sheer fantasy. For those who have made a few steps in the direction of supersensible observation, it's always very useful to become familiar with such accounts by people for whom supersensible science is mere fantasy, since it is not so easy to attribute these accounts to bias on the part of the observer. Parenthesis, it is to be hoped that spiritual scientists will learn a great deal from those who consider their efforts ridiculous, and it need not confuse them if their critics do not return their affection. Of course, supersensible observation itself does not aim to verify its own results through such things. It refers to them not in order to prove its findings, but only to clarify them. Parenthesis. In his memoirs, Moritz Benedict, an eminent criminologist and well-known researcher in many other fields of natural science, relates a personal experience. Once he nearly drowned while swimming, and saw his whole life flash before him in retrospect as if in a single picture. Footnote. Moritz Benedict, 1835-1920, in his autobiography Aus meinem Leben, Erinnerungen und Erörterungen, excerpts from my life, recollections and commentary, Vienna 1906, page 35, Benedict describes this instance as follows, quote, I have had a great love for water ever since childhood, and this has prompted several experiences that stick in my memory. I went to great lengths to be able to swim outdoors, and once it happened that I went under while swimming in the Danube. Fortunately, I was driven up against a post that served as a marker for swimmers. For scarcely more than half a minute I was conscious of the fact that I was drowning, and made the remarkable observation that in that brief time my memories of my entire life passed in front of me at top speed. Psychologists are familiar with this observation, but few people have experienced it personally. I was about 12 years old at the time. End of footnote. If the images seen by others on similar occasions are described differently and even seem to have little to do with the events of their past, this does not contradict what was said above. The images that arise in this unusual state of separation from the physical body are often not readily explainable in terms of their relationship to life. However, if they are considered in the right way, this relationship can always be recognized. If someone was once near drowning and did not have the experiences described here, this in no way detracts from the general description. We must keep in mind that these experiences can take place only when the ether body is really separated from the physical body, but remains united with the astral body. When the shock also causes a loosening of the connection between the ether body and the astral body, these experiences do not take place because complete loss of consciousness occurs, as it does during dreamless sleep. In the time immediately after death, our experiences of the past appear, combined into a single memory picture. After that, the astral body separates from the ether body and continues its journey on its own. It is not difficult to see that everything the astral body acquired through its own activity during its stay in the physical body now remains in it. The I developed the spirit self, the life spirit, and the spirit body to a certain extent. To the extent that these have been developed, they do not owe their existence to the organs of the various bodies, but to the I, which needs no outer organs either for self-perception or to remain in possession of what it has united with itself. In that case, we might wonder why we have no perception during sleep of the spirit self, life spirit, and spirit body that have developed. The reason for this is that the I is fettered to the physical body between birth and death. Even when it is with the astral body outside the physical body during sleep, it is still closely connected to the physical body because the astral body's activity is directed toward the physical body at that point. In this state, the I and its perception are directed toward to the outer sensory world and prevented from receiving the revelations of the spirit directly. Death allows these revelations to reach the I for the first time, because death frees the I from its connection to the physical and ether bodies. The moment the soul withdraws from the physical world that lays claim to all of its activity during life, another world lights up for it. Even during this time, not all of our connections to the outer sense-perceptible world have been terminated. Instead, they are maintained by certain desires that are still present. These desires are the ones we create through being conscious of the I as the fourth element of our makeup. Desires and wishes that spring from the nature of the three lower bodies can only be active in the external world, and they cease when these bodies are discarded. Hunger, for example, comes about through the external body and is silenced as soon as this body is no longer connected to the I. If the I had no desires other than those that originate in its own spiritual nature, it would be completely satisfied by the spiritual world into which it is transported at death. Life, however, has given it other desires. Life kindled a longing in it for pleasures that can only be satisfied by physical organs, although these pleasures are not inherent in the organs themselves. The three bodies are not the only elements that expect satisfaction from the physical world. The I also finds certain pleasures in this world, pleasures that the spiritual world has no means of providing. For the I, there are two types of desires in life: those that originate within the bodies and must also be satisfied there, coming to an end when the bodies disintegrate, and those that originate in its own spiritual nature. The latter are also satisfied by means of bodily organs as long as the I inhabits the bodies, since the hidden element of the spirit manifests in bodily organs. Along with everything the senses perceive, they also take in something spiritual. This spiritual element is also present after death, although in a different form. Everything of a spiritual nature that the I desires within the sense-perceptible world is also still there when the senses are no longer present. If there were not a third type of desire in addition to these two, death would signify only a transition from desires that can be satisfied by the senses to those that find fulfillment in the revelation of the spiritual world. The third type of desire consists of the ones the I creates for itself during life in the sense-perceptible world, because it also takes pleasure in aspects of this world in which the spirit does not manifest. The lowest pleasures can be manifestations of the spirit. The satisfaction a hungry being gains from taking in food is a manifestation of the spirit, because if it did not take in nourishment, the spiritual element would not be able to evolve in a certain respect. However, the I can also move beyond the enjoyment offered by this necessary state of affairs. It can long for food that tastes good, regardless of how eating serves the spirit. The same thing happens with regard to other things in the sensory world. This creates desires that would never appear in the sense-perceptible world if the human I were not incorporated into it. Such desires, however, also do not originate in the spiritual nature of the I. Even as a spiritual being, the I must have sensory pleasures as long as it lives in a body. The spirit manifests in sense-perceptible things, and the I is enjoying nothing other than the spirit when it gives itself up to sense-perceptible things through which the light of the spirit shines. The I will continue to enjoy this light even when sensuality is no longer the medium for the rays of the spirit. In the spiritual world, however, no gratification exists for desires not already inhabited by the spirit in the sense-perceptible world. When death occurs, the possibility of satisfying these particular desires is cut off. The desire to enjoy good-tasting food can only be satisfied when the physical organs used in taking in food are present, the palate, the tongue, and so on. After shedding the physical body, we no longer have these. And if the I still needs to have these desires satisfied, this need must remain unmet. To the extent that this desire is in accord with the spirit, it is present only as long as the physical organs are there, but to the extent that the I has created it without serving the spirit, it persists after death as a desire that yearns in vain for satisfaction. We can only get an idea of what then takes place in the human being by imagining that someone is suffering from raging thirst in an area where there is no water far or near. That is how things stand with the I after death, to the extent that it still cherishes unextinguished desires for the pleasures of the outer world. and no longer possesses organs that could satisfy them. Of course, we must imagine the raging thirst that is an analogy for the state of the eye after death as being intensified immeasurably and encompassing all other remaining desires that cannot possibly be satisfied. After death, the eye immediately finds itself in the situation of having to free itself from the shackles of this attraction to the outer world. In this respect, the eye has to bring about purification and liberation within itself. It must eradicate all the desires that came about in it during life in the body, which therefore have no right to exist in the spiritual world. The world of these desires is dissolved and destroyed after death like an object that is seized and consumed by fire. This offers us a glimpse into the world that supersensible knowledge calls the, quote, consuming fire of the spirit, unquote. Any desire that is sensual in nature, in a sense that is not an expression of the spirit, is seized upon by this fire. We might feel terrified and inconsolable when we confront the conceptions of these processes that spiritual science inevitably supplies. It might seem shocking that a hope that needs sense organs for its fulfillment must turn into hopelessness after death, and that a desire can only be satisfied by the physical world must be transformed into searing deprivation. However, it is possible to maintain this view only as long as we fail to consider that all the desires seized upon by this consuming fire after our death are not beneficial ones in any higher sense, but represent destructive forces in life. Through such forces, the eye binds itself more closely to the world of the senses than is necessary for taking in its beneficial aspects. This world is a revelation of the spiritual element concealed behind it. If the eye chose not to make use of the senses to enjoy this spiritual element, it would never be able to enjoy the spirit in this form, in which it can reveal itself only through the bodily senses. However, to the extent that the eye desires the aspects of the sense world in which the spirit does not speak, it deprives itself of the world's true spiritual reality. If sensory enjoyment as an expression of the spirit signifies an elevation and development of the eye, then enjoyment that is not such an expression signifies impoverishment and desolation. If a desire of this latter sort is satisfied in the sense world, its devastating effect on the eye, although present, does not become visible until after death. That is why enjoying such pleasures in life can create new, similar desires, although we are not at all aware that we are enveloping ourselves in a consuming fire. What becomes visible after death is nothing other than what was already present around us during life. And when it becomes visible, its healing, beneficial consequences also become evident. For example, a person who loves someone else is not attracted only to the aspects of the other person that can be experienced through physical organs. However, these are the only aspects that can be said to become inaccessible to perception at death. After death, the aspect of the beloved person, for which physical organs were only a means to an end, becomes visible. In fact, the only thing that prevents this other higher aspect from being completely visible is the presence of desires that can only be satisfied by means of physical organs. If this desire were not eradicated, conscious perception of the beloved person after death could not come about at all. Seen in this way, the terrifying, inconsolable conception we might have of post-death events, as they are described by supersensible knowledge, is transformed into a conception that is deeply satisfying and consoling. The experiences we have immediately after death differ from life's experiences in still another respect. During purification, we live life in reverse, so to speak. We go through everything we experienced during life since birth, but in reverse order, back to childhood, beginning with events immediately preceding our death. In this process, everything in our life that did not originate in the spiritual nature of the eye appears spiritually before us, but we experience its inverse. For example, if a person dies at age 60 but injured someone else in body or soul at age 40, he or she will experience this event again on reaching this point in his or her 40th year on the journey back through life. However, what is experienced this time will not be the satisfaction that came from attacking the other, but the pain the other person suffered as a result. From what has just been described, we can immediately see that the only part of such an incident that can be perceived as painful after death is the part originating in a desire of the I that has its source purely in the outer physical world. In reality, the I not only harms the other person by satisfying such a desire, it also harms itself. But this damage remains invisible during life. After death, however, this whole damaging world of desire becomes visible to the I. The I then feels drawn to every being and thing that once kindled such desires in it, so that these desires can be eradicated in the consuming fire, in the same way that they were created. On our journey back through life, all our desires of this sort will have gone through the fire of purification only when we reach the point of our birth again. From that point onward, nothing prevents us from dedicating ourselves completely to the spiritual world. We enter a new level of existence. Just as we discarded the physical body at death and the ether body soon after, the part of the astral body that can survive only in our consciousness of the outer world now disintegrates. For supersensible knowledge, therefore, there are three corpses: the physical, the etheric, and the astral. We discard the last of these at the end of the purification period, which is about 1/3 as long as the time that elapses between birth and death. The reason for this will become clear later on when we consider the course of a human life on the basis of esoteric science. Just as physical corpses are physically perceptible in the world we live in, for supersensible observation, astral corpses are constantly present in the surroundings, having been discarded by human beings who are moving from the state of purification into a higher level of existence. As far as the I is concerned, a totally new state of consciousness sets in after purification. Before death, outer perceptions had to flow toward the I for the light of consciousness to shine on them. But now a world virtually flows outward from within and comes to consciousness. The I lived in this world between birth and death too, but then it was veiled in sense-perceptible manifestations, only appearing in its real form when the I disregarded all sense perceptions and perceived itself in its own inner sanctuary. Just as pre-death self-perception on the part of the I took place within, in its inner being, the world of spirit in all its fullness is also revealed from within after death and purification. Actually, this world is already revealed as soon as the ether body is discarded. It is simply obscured, as if by a darkening cloud, by all our desires that still turn toward the outer world. It is as if the dark demonic shadows, rising from desires consumed by fire, were mingling with a blissful world of spiritual experience. And not only shadows, these desires are real beings. This immediately becomes apparent when the I is stripped of physical organs, and therefore becomes able to perceive things that are spiritual in character. These beings appear as distorted caricatures of what we formerly learned about through sense perception. Supersensible observation states that the world of the purifying fire is inhabited by beings whose appearance can be horrible and painful to the spiritual eye. EYE. They seem to take pleasure in destruction. Their passion is intent upon an evil that makes the evil of the sense-perceptible world seem insignificant in comparison. When we bring desires of the sort described above into the supersensible world, they appear to these creatures as food that constantly nourishes and strengthens their powers. This image of a world imperceptible to the senses can seem less incredible if we observe a portion of the animal kingdom without bias. To spiritual sight, what is a cruel, prowling wolf? What reveals itself in what the senses perceive in it? Nothing but a soul that lives in and acts out of desires. We can call the outward form of a wolf an embodiment of these desires. If we had no organs to perceive this form, we would still have to acknowledge the existence of the being in question if its invisible desires became visible through their effects. That is, if a power invisible to the eye were prowling around doing everything that can be done by a visible wolf. Now, it is true that the beings of the purifying fire are present only to supersensible consciousness and not to sense perception. However, their effects, namely the destruction of the eye if it supplies them with nourishment, are clearly evident. These effects become visible when justifiable enjoyment escalates to the point of immoderation and excess, for sense-perceptible things would also only attract the eye to the extent that enjoying them is somehow justified in the very nature of the eye itself. Animals are driven to desire only through things in the outer world that their three bodies crave. But human beings have higher desires, because a fourth element, the eye, is added to their three bodily elements. But if the eye seeks to satisfy such desires in a way that destroys its own being, rather than maintaining and furthering it, this is a result not of the effect of its three bodies, or of its own nature, but of beings whose true form is concealed from our senses, beings who can assail the higher nature of the eye, and are capable of arousing desires in it that, although unrelated to sensory existence, can only be satisfied through it. The food of these beings consists of passions and desires that are worse than any animal passions, because they are not played out in the sense world, but take hold of the spiritual element and drag it down into the domain of the senses. Therefore the forms of such beings appear much more hideous and gruesome to spiritual sight than the forms of the wildest animals, which only embody passions that are justifiable in the sense-perceptible world. The destructive forces of these beings are infinitely greater than any destructive fury that exists in the sense-perceptible animal kingdom. In this way, supersensible knowledge must expand our view to include a world of beings that are lower in a certain respect than any visible destructive animals. Having passed through this world after death, we then find ourselves face to face with a world that contains the spiritual element. The only desire this world arouses in us finds satisfaction in the spirit alone. Here, too, however, we distinguish between what belongs to our own eye and what constitutes its surroundings, what we might also call the spiritual world outside of the eye. Now, however, what we experience of these surroundings streams toward us in the same way that our perception of our own eye streams toward us during life in the body. During life, between birth and death, our surroundings speak to us through the organs of our bodies. But once we have discarded all our bodies, the language of our own surroundings speaks directly to the innermost sanctuary of the eye. Our entire surroundings are now filled with beings that are similar in nature to our eye, for only an eye has access to another eye. Just as we are surrounded in the sense-perceptible world by the minerals, plants, and animals that make up that world, after death we are surrounded by a world that is made up of beings of a spiritual nature. However, something that is not part of our surroundings there comes with us into the spiritual world. That is, what the eye has experienced in the sense-perceptible world. Immediately after our death, and for as long as our ether body is still connected to the eye, the sum total of these experiences appears temporarily in the form of a comprehensive memory picture. The ether body itself is then discarded, of course, but something of this memory picture remains behind as an imperishable possession of the eye, as if we had made an extract or distillation of everything that happened to us between birth and death. This is life's spiritual yield, its fruits. Since this yield is of a spiritual nature, it contains everything spiritual that has been revealed through our senses. Without life in the sense-perceptible world, it would not have come about. After death, the eye feels this spiritual fruit of the sensory world to be its own inner world, through which it enters the world of beings that manifest as only an eye can become manifest to itself in its innermost depths. Just as a plant seed, which is the essence of the entire plant, can only develop when it is planted in a different world, namely the soil, what the eye brings along from the sensory world now unfurls like a sprouting seed, and the spiritual environment that has received it begins to affect it. It is true that the science of the supersensible can only use images to describe what happens in this land of spirits. But when supersensible consciousness investigates the events invisible to the physical EYE that correspond to these images, it becomes evident that the images represent a true reality. Comparisons with the sensory world can illustrate what needs to be depicted, since although this other world is completely spiritual in character, it is similar to the sense world in a certain respect. For example, in the sensory world, a color appears when some object acts upon the eye, EYE. Similarly, in the land of spirits, an experience similar to the one induced by a color is produced when the eye is acted upon by another being. During life, between birth and death, however, the inner perception of the eye is the only experience that is induced in the same way as this color-like spiritual experience. This is not like light striking us from outside. It is as if another being were acting directly upon the eye, causing it to imagine this activity as a colored picture. Thus all the beings in the spiritual environment of the eye express themselves in a world radiant with color. Since the way they come about is different, of course, these experiences of color in the spiritual world are also of a somewhat different character than sense-perceptible colors, and something similar must be said with regard to the other impressions we receive from the sense-perceptible world. The sounds of the spiritual world are most similar to impressions in the sensory world. The more we live our way into the spiritual world, the more it appears to us as a freely moving vitality that is comparable to tones and harmonies in sense-perceptible reality. However, we do not sense these tones as something that approaches a sense organ from outside, but rather as a force streaming through the eye out into the world. We feel the tones the same way we feel our own speech or singing in the sense-perceptible world. But in the spiritual world, we know that these tones that are streaming out of us are also manifestations of other beings who are pouring themselves out into the world through us. A still higher manifestation takes place in the land of spirits, when sound becomes the quote-unquote spiritual word. Then, not only the movement-filled vitality of another spiritual being, but also the being itself communicates its own inner nature to the eye. When this happens, when the spiritual word flows through the eye, two beings live within each other without any of the separation that is a necessary part of togetherness in the sense-perceptible world. This is really what it is like for the eye to be together with other spiritual beings after death. I'm on page 91. I have just finished paragraph 16, and is pretty much the first half of Sleep and Death, from An Outline of Esoteric Science by Rudolf Steiner. This is the second half of the third chapter of An Outline of Esoteric Science by Rudolf Steiner. The chapter 3 is entitled Sleep and Death. I am on page 91 of that chapter, the 17th paragraph. 3 distinct domains of the land of spirits appear to supersensible consciousness. They may be compared to 3 regions in the physical sense-perceptible world. The first is the spiritual world's quote-unquote land masses, so to speak. The second is its quote-unquote bodies of water. The third is its quote-unquote atmosphere. In the first domain of the land of spirits, everything that assumes a physical shape on earth so that it can be perceived by means of physical organs is perceived according to its spiritual nature. For example, the force that gives a crystal its shape can be perceived in the land of spirits, but its manifestation there is the opposite of what appears in the sense-perceptible world, so to speak. To spiritual sight, The space occupied by a mass of rock in the physical world appears as a cavity of some sort, but the force that shapes the form of the stone is seen all around this cavity. The color the stone possesses in the sense-perceptible world appears as an experience of its complementary color in the spiritual world. Thus, from the viewpoint of the land of spirits, a red stone appears greenish, and a green one is experienced as reddish. All other characteristics also appear in the form of their opposites. Just as things, such as stones and masses of soil, make up the sense-perceptible world's land masses or continents, the formations described above constitute the spiritual world's land masses. In quotes. Everything that is life in the sense-perceptible world is the oceanic region in the spiritual world. To our physical eyes, life is evident in its effects in plants, animals, and human beings. To our spiritual eyes, life is a being that flows, permeating the land of spirits like seas and rivers. Better still, it can be compared to blood circulation in the body. Because the distribution of seas and rivers in the sense-perceptible world is irregular, while a certain regularity, like that of the circulating blood, is the rule in the distribution of flowing life in the land of spirits. At the same time, this flowing life is also heard. It resounds spiritually, as it were. The third domain of the land of spirits is its atmosphere, in quotes. Everything that appears in the sense-perceptible world as feeling exists in the spiritual realm as an all-pervading presence, just like the air on earth. We must imagine it as a sea of flowing feeling. Sorrow and pain, joy and delight flow throughout the domain like winds and storms in the atmosphere of the sense-perceptible world. Let's imagine a battle being fought on earth. Not only human figures with forms that can be seen with physical eyes confront each other here, but feelings confront feelings and passions confront passions. The battlefield is not only full of human figures, it is also full of pain. All the passions, the pain, and the joy of conquest that are active here not only manifest as sense-perceptible effects, but also become perceptible to spiritual senses as an atmospheric process in the land of spirits. In the spirit, an event like this is like a thunderstorm in the physical world. Spiritual perception of such events can also be compared to hearing words in the physical world. That is why it is said that, quote, wafting spiritual words, unquote, surround and permeate the beings and events of the land of spirits, just as air surrounds and permeates the beings of earth. Still other perceptions are possible in this spiritual world. Something comparable to the warmth and light of the physical world is also present here. The actual world of thoughts is what pervades everything in the land of spirits, like the warmth that pervades all earthly things and beings. Here, however, we must imagine these thoughts as living, independent beings. What we grasp as a thought in the manifest world is like a shadow of a thought being that is active in the land of spirits. Let's imagine that a thought is extracted from the human being in which it is present and is endowed with an inner life of its own as an active entity. We then have a feeble illustration of the content of the fourth domain in the land of spirits. What we perceive as thoughts in our physical world between birth and death is merely a manifestation of the thought world, shaped as the instruments of our various bodies permit. But all the thoughts we cultivate that enrich the physical world have their origin in this spiritual domain. We need not think only of the thoughts and ideas of great inventors or geniuses in this regard. We can see how we all have ideas that suddenly occur to us, not merely ideas that are due to the outer world, but ideas we use to transform this outer world. To the extent that we speak of feelings and passions whose causes lie in the outer world, these belong to the third domain of the land of spirits. But everything that lives in our souls in a way that makes creators of us, everything that allows us to transform and fructify our surroundings, is evident in its primal, essential form in the spiritual world's fourth domain. What is present in the fifth domain can be compared to physical light. It is wisdom, revealing itself in its primal form. Beings belonging to this domain pour wisdom out into their surroundings, like the sun that sheds light on physical beings. A thing is illuminated by this wisdom. Let me read that again. A thing that is illuminated by this wisdom shows its true significance and meaning for the spiritual world, just as a physical being shows its color when shone upon by light. There are still higher domains of the land of spirits, but that will be described in a later part of this book. After death, the eye, along with what it brings with it from life in the world of the senses, is immersed in the spiritual world. What its past life yielded is still united with the part of the astral body that is not discarded at the end of the purification period. As we have seen, only the part whose desires and longings are still directed toward physical life falls away after death. Immersing the eye and its past life's yield in the spiritual world can be likened to planting a seed in fertile soil. The seed draws on substances and forces from its surroundings in order to develop into a new plant. Similarly, development and growth are the very essence of the eye that has been immersed in the spiritual world. The force that creates an organ lies hidden within what that organ perceives. Our eyes perceive light, but without light there would be no eyes. Creatures that spend their life in darkness do not develop any organs of sight. Similarly, the whole bodily human being is created out of the forces lying hidden in what is perceived by the organs of our various bodies. The physical world is built up by the forces of the physical world, the ether body by those of the world of life, and the astral body out of the astral world. Now, when the eye is transported into the land of spirits, it encounters these forces, which are hidden to physical perception. In the first domain of the land of spirits, the spiritual beings that always surround human beings, building up our physical bodies, become visible to the eye. In the physical world, what we perceive is nothing other than the manifestations of these spiritual forces that have shaped the human physical body. After death, we find ourselves surrounded by these same formative forces, but now they show themselves in their true forms, which were previously concealed. Similarly, in the second domain, we find ourselves in the midst of the forces that make up the ether body, while in the third domain, the forces that stream toward us have organized the astral body. What the higher domains of the land of spirits send toward us is also what constitutes our makeup during life between birth and death. From this point onward, these beings of the spiritual world work in conjunction with what we have brought with us as the fruit of our former life, which now becomes a seed. Through their interaction, we are first built up anew as spiritual beings. When we sleep, our physical and ether bodies persist. The astral body and the eye, although outside of these two bodies, remain connected to them. Any influences the astral body and the eye can receive from the spiritual world under these circumstances serve only to replenish the forces we have exhausted while awake. However, after the end of the purification period, when we have discarded not only the physical and ether bodies, but also the part of the astral body that still clung to the physical world through its desires, everything flowing from the spiritual world toward the eye serves not only to improve it, but also to reconfigure it. And after a certain period of time, parenthesis spoken of later on in this book, parenthesis, an astral body forms around the eye and becomes capable of living in etheric and physical bodies of the sort appropriate to human beings between birth and death. Then we are ready to undergo birth again and to appear in a new earth existence, which then incorporates the fruit of our previous life. Up to the point of forming a new astral body, we witness our own rebuilding. Since the powers of the land of spirits, like our self-aware eye, manifest from within rather than through outer organs, we are able to perceive their manifestations as long as our faculties are not yet directed toward an outwardly perceptible world. However, the moment the astral body has taken shape again, these faculties turn outward, From that point onward, the astral body again begins to demand an external ether body and physical body, and turns away from the revelations of the inner world. For this reason, an interim period of sinking into unconsciousness now begins. Consciousness will be able to appear again only in the physical world, when the organs necessary for physical perception have been formed. During this time, when the consciousness illuminated by inner perception has come to an end, a new ether body begins to connect to the astral body, and we can then enter a physical body again. The only I that would be capable of taking part consciously in reconnecting to these two elements would be one that had succeeded in creating a life spirit and spirit body, the creative forces hidden in the ether and physical bodies. Until we reach this stage, beings that are further along in their development than we are must direct this process of reconnecting. These beings lead the astral body to a set of parents so that it can be given the appropriate etheric and physical bodies. Before the connection to the ether body has been completed, something happens that is extremely significant for us as we enter physical existence again. As we have seen, each of us in our previous life created destructive forces that became evident during our journey backward after death. Let's look again at the example mentioned earlier. In the previous lifetime, the person in question, who was 40 years old at the time, caused pain to someone else in an outburst of anger, and later, after death, encountered that other person's pain as a force destructive to the development of his or her own I. The same is true of all similar incidents in this person's previous life. These obstacles to development then confront the person's I when it re-enters physical life. Just as the I saw a kind of memory picture of the past life as death set in, it now has a preview of the life to come. Once again, this person sees a picture of this sort, but this time it shows all the obstacles that need to be overcome in order to make progress along the path of self-development. What is seen in this way becomes the starting point for forces that this person must take along into his or her new life. The image of the pain inflicted on another becomes the force that motivates the I on re-entering life to make up for this pain. Thus our previous life has a determining effect on the new one. In a certain respect, our deeds in this new life are caused by ones in our previous life. We must see this lawful and regular connection between an earlier existence and a later one as the law of destiny. We usually apply the term karma, borrowed from Oriental wisdom, to this law. However, building up a new bodily organization is not the only activity that is required of us between death and a new birth. During this process we live outside of the physical world, but meanwhile the physical world continues to evolve. The face of the earth changes within a relatively short period of time. A few thousand years ago, what did the region look like that our country now occupies? As a general rule, when we appear on earth in a new existence, it does not look the way it did during our last lifetime. All kinds of things have changed in our absence. Now, hidden forces are also at work, changing the face of the earth. They work out of the world we find ourselves in after death, and we too must help to transform the earth. However, as long as we have not become clearly conscious of the relationship between the spiritual element and its physical expression by creating the life spirit and spirit body in ourselves, we require the guidance of higher beings if we are to assist in this transformation, but we do assist in it nonetheless. We can say that during the time between death and a new birth, we transform the earth in a way that aligns its conditions with what is developing within us. If we observe some spot on earth at a certain point in time, and again after a long time has elapsed, we find it in a totally different condition. The forces that have brought about this change are present among human beings who have died. This is how they are connected with the earth between death and rebirth. Supersensible consciousness sees manifestations of the hidden spiritual element in all of physical existence. To physical observation, what works at transforming the earth is the light of the sun, changes in climate, and so on. To supersensible observation, however, the forces of people who have died are active in the rays of sunlight falling on the plants. If we observe in this way, we become aware of human souls hovering around the plants, transforming the surface of the earth, and so on. In death, our attention is not focused only on ourselves and on preparing our own new earthly existence. No, we are also called upon to work spiritually on the outer world, just as we are called upon to work physically during life between birth and death. Not only does human life work on circumstances in the physical world from the land of spirits, but the reverse is also true. Activity in physical existence has its effects in the spiritual world. An example can illustrate what happens in this connection. A bond of love exists between mother and child. This love arises out of an attraction between the two of them that is rooted in the sense world, but it changes over the course of time. The sensory bond becomes more and more spiritual. And this spiritual bond is fashioned not only for the sake of the physical world, but for the land of spirits as well. This is also true of other relationships. What is fashioned in the physical world by spiritual beings persists in the spiritual world. Friends who have become intimately connected during life also belong together in the land of spirits. After they have discarded their various bodies, their togetherness is much more intimate than it was during physical life, for as spirits they are there for each other, in the same way that spiritual beings reveal themselves to others from the inside, as described above. Also, a bond that has formed between two people leads them together again in a new life. In the truest sense of the word, therefore, we must speak of people finding each other again after death. This process that takes place with human beings between birth and death, and then from death to a new birth, repeats itself. We return to earth again and again whenever the fruit of one physical lifetime has ripened in the land of spirits. Yet this repetition does not go on without beginning or end. At one point we left different forms of existence for ones that run their course as described here. And in future we will leave these and move on to others. An overview of these changing stages will be presented later, when the evolution of the cosmos in its relationship to the human being is described from the viewpoint of supersensible consciousness. Of course, the processes that take place between death and a new birth are even more hidden from outer sensory observation than is the case with the spiritual element underlying our existence as it manifests between birth and death. Sense perception can see the effects of this part of the hidden world only where these effects enter physical existence. For sensory observation, the question is whether human beings entering existence through birth bring along something of the processes that supersensible knowledge describes between a death and the next birth. Even if we find a snail shell with no trace of an animal in it, we will acknowledge that the shell came about through the activity of an animal. We will not be able to believe that this form created itself by means of mere physical forces. Similarly, if we observe people during life and discover something that cannot have originated in this life, it is reasonable to admit that it originates in what the science of the supersensible describes, if this sheds clarifying light on something that is otherwise unexplainable. Thus it is also possible for rational sensory observation to understand invisible causes through their visible effects. Any unbiased observer of our current life will find this more and more correct with each new observation. It is simply a question of finding the right point of view for observing effects in outer life. For example, where are the effects of what supersensible knowledge describes as processes belonging to the purification period? How do effects appear that belong to what we are supposed to experience after this realm of purification in the purely spiritual realm, according to details provided by spiritual research? If we reflect on life deeply and seriously, there are plenty of riddles that demand our attention in this particular area. We see one person born into poverty and misery, endowed with only meager talents and seemingly predestined for a pitiable existence because of the circumstances of his or her birth. Meanwhile, another person receives lavish care and attention from solicitous hands and hearts from the first moment of life, develops brilliant capabilities, and has all the potential for a fruitful and satisfying life. We can respond to such questions with one or two opposing points of view. The first one clings to what we can perceive with our senses and understand with our sense-bound intellect. This view does not question the fact that one person is born to happiness and another to misfortune. Even if it doesn't use the term chance, it will not think of assuming that there is some lawful interrelatedness that causes such disparities. And when it comes to potentials and talents, this way of looking at things will attribute them to what is inherited, unquote, in quotes, inherited, from parents, grandparents, and other ancestors. It will refuse to look for causes in spiritual processes undergone by the person in question before birth, processes that shaped his or her potentials and talents, yet are quite independent of his or her line of descent. However, there is also a second point of view that will feel unsatisfied with this interpretation, insisting that even in the manifest world we do not see things happen in specific places or under specific circumstances without needing to assume that there are reasons why they happen. Even though these causes remain undiscovered in many instances, they are present nonetheless. Alpine flowers do not grow on lowland plains. There is something in their nature that brings them together with alpine surroundings. Likewise, there must be something in a person that causes him or her to be born into a particular environment. Causes that lie only in the physical world are not enough to explain this. To any more profound thinker, assuming that such causes are sufficient would be like assuming that the fact that one person hits another doesn't have to do with the feelings of the person doing the hitting, but only with the physical mechanism of his or her hand. This second viewpoint is equally dissatisfied with any explanation of predispositions and talents as qualities that are merely quote-unquote inherited. Nevertheless, it can be pointed out that certain abilities do run in families. Musical abilities were passed down in the Bach family for 250 years. Footnote: in the 17th and 18th centuries, this German family produced over 50 musicians. End footnote. The Bernoulli family produced 8 mathematicians, some of whom were earmarked for quite different careers as children. Footnote: a prominent family of mathematicians in Basel during the 17th and 18th centuries. Jakob Senior, 1654 to 1705, studied theology. Johann Senior, 1667 to 1748, studied medicine. And Jakob Hermann, 1678 to 1759, studied theology before turning to mathematics. Nicolaus Senior, 1687 to 1759, studied law. Nicolaus Junior, 1695 to 1726, studied mathematics and law. Daniel, 1700 to 1782, studied medicine. End of footnote. But their quote-unquote inherited talents always drove them into the family profession, after all. Furthermore, it can be pointed out that exact investigation of someone's line of descent always demonstrates that in one way or another this person's talents were evident in his or her ancestors and are only an accumulation of inherited tendencies. People who hold the second point of view will certainly not disregard such facts, but these cannot mean as much to them as they do to those who want to base their explanations purely on processes taking place in the sense-perceptible world. Adherents of the second view will point out that it is just as impossible for inherited predispositions to assemble themselves into a unitary personality as it is for metal clock parts to assemble themselves into a clock. To the objection that the parents working together can bring about this combination of predispositions and that this takes the place of the watchmaker, as it were, they will reply, quote, if you look at it impartially, you will find an element in each child's personality that is completely new. This cannot come from the child's parents, simply because it was not present in them. Unquote. Unclear thinking can cause a great deal of confusion in this area. The worst is if adherents of the first viewpoint see adherents of the second as opposing something that is based on positive fact, while it may not even occur to the latter to deny the truth or value of such facts. They too see quite clearly that a particular cultural predisposition or spiritual direction is, quote-unquote, passed down within a family, and that if certain predispositions are combined and accumulate, they can result in an outstanding personality. They are quite capable of agreeing that the most illustrious name almost always stands at the end of a bloodline rather than at the beginning. It should not be held against them, however, if they are forced to hold ideas that are quite different from those of people who choose not to go beyond sense-perceptible facts. These people can be rebutted by saying that individuals certainly do demonstrate certain characteristics belonging to their ancestors, because the element of spirit and soul that enters physical existence through birth derives its bodily nature from what heredity provides. However, this says nothing more than that a being shares the idiosyncrasies of the medium in which it is immersed. Unbiased minds will not deny the justification for the comparison, although it is certainly a strange and trivial one, if we say that the fact that a human being appears clothed in the traits of his or her ancestors says just as little about the origin of this individual's personal characteristics as being wet from falling into the water says about the wet person's inner character. Furthermore, the fact that the most illustrious name stands at the end of a bloodline demonstrates that the bearer of this name needed that bloodline in order to fashion the body that was necessary for the development of his or her entire personality. This proves nothing about the quote-unquote inheritability of the personal element itself. In fact, it proves the exact opposite as far as healthy logic is concerned. If personal talents actually were passed down within a family, they would have to stand at the beginning of a bloodline to be transmitted to the descendants. The fact that they are present at the end, however, is evident that they are not passed down. Of course, it would be easy to misunderstand the statement that if an individual's personal gifts were simply subject to the law of heredity, they would have to appear at the beginning of a bloodline. We might say, quote, well, they cannot appear there because they have to develop first, unquote. This is not a valid objection, because when we want to prove that something has been inherited from a predecessor, we have to demonstrate that the predecessor's previously existing trait becomes evident again in a descendant. If it is apparent